Coming in at 5, the 27 Club. Whether you realise it or not, we're all familiar with the 27 Club in one way or another. It's a club that was formed following a strange number of deaths that occurred in the music and film industry, with all of its members dying at the age of 27. People began to take note of this phenomenon between 1969 and 1971, during which time Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison all passed away, and all at the age of 27. However, the name itself was born following the death of Kurt Cobain, who died in 1994, once again at the age of 27. Fast forward to 2011, global superstar Amy Winehouse also passed away at the age of 27. It is a bizarre coincidence that doesn't seem to be dissipating. When you think the curse may be broke, another musician joins the club. It's heartbreaking to see anyone die that young, but it is completely baffling as to why it's happening. A study published in the British Medical Journal stated that there's no increased risk of musicians dying at the age of 27. Yeah. Why is it happening? In at 4, Anthony Hopkins. The world works in mysterious ways sometimes, particularly for Anthony Hopkins in 1973. The Hannibal Lecter actor accepted the title role in George Pfeiffer's The Girl from Petrovka, which was also based on the book by the same name. Now, being a thorough actor and wanting to do his research, Hopkins went to a few bookstores in London, hunting for the original novel, but to no avail. He was on the verge of giving up and going home when he caught a glimpse of an abandoned book just sitting on a bench. And guess what? It was The Girl from Petrovka. 2 years later, when it came time to film, George Pfeiffer, the author, admitted to Hopkins that even he didn't have a copy of his own book and that he lent it to a friend in London who had lost it. And, I quote, "It was complete with all of my annotation." Hopkins pulled out his copy, and guess what? It was the same one.
Next up at number 3, the mystery of Oak Island. And whilst many of you will know this particular entry, there's no denying the fact that the eternal mystery that is Oak Island is worth mentioning every single damn time, and its inception is an event that has long evaded the unscrupulous eye of history. You know the story, right? In Nova Scotia, just off the coast of eastern Canada, lies a small island that has allegedly been the site of our civilization's greatest of treasures, although no one has ever been able to locate the exact point of where that treasure lies, causing countless individuals to fall into a wild obsession with unearthing its eternal mystery. In fact, the cause of Oak Island's mystery is down to the fact people have found treasure there, many of which have been carbon dated to several hundred years old, and the story of the Money Pit, a mysterious shaft that has been excavated countless times throughout history, which actually exists with actual structural records, has forced dozens of businesses to go bankrupt trying to solve its enigma. So here we are with our mystery. Who the hell built this place? Now, there are hundreds of theories as to who would have constructed such an intricate place to conceal their treasure, the most popular being Captain William Kidd, the pirate that sailed to North America in the late 1600s, burying his plunder there so no one else could find it. Another theory states that the pit was constructed to house none other than Mary Antoinette's jewels, who after the Parisian uprising at the Palace of Versailles gave her treasures to a lady-in-waiting, who then fled France and ended up in Nova Scotia, where, using her royal connections, contracted the French Navy to construct the Oak Island pit, making sure that the incredibly rare jewels of her queen would never be discovered. And strangely enough, there has actually been credible evidence for this theory recently in 2017, when a 500-year-old brooch was discovered containing a huge garnet similar to that of which Mary Antoinette was reported to often wear. I mean, we could talk about all of these theories for an entire video, but as so far as unsolved events in history go, this one remains to be exactly that. Swinging in at number 2, the Yone Monument. Okay, where do we even begin with this one? Because if you've seen any of our ancient mystery series, then this one definitely deserves its place amongst their ilk. But the event that we're possibly alluding to in the case of the Yone Monument may be a geological enigma that predates known civilization itself, involving an entire continent submerging deep beneath the ocean. Yeah, and whilst that may sound like a massive leap, let's just take a look at the strange properties of the Yone Monument before we jump to any kind of conclusions. Off the coast of Japan, submerged beneath the southernmost Ryukyu Islands, lie a formation of potentially man-made monoliths, which has led to decades of debate as to the true nature of this strange geological formation. The monument itself consists of very fine sandstone and mudstone, with its main feature being a rectangular formation measuring about 90 feet tall and consisting of several other strange formations that seemingly don't make sense as to how they have been naturally formed. Now, despite this massive debate between the Yone Monument being natural or man-made, made, perhaps the most mind-blowing theory comes from the renowned geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, who states that the Yone Monument is indeed most likely a natural formation, possibly used and modified by humans in the past, before seemingly sliding away to the murky depths of the ocean during a geological event that occurred in ancient history. On the flip side, the geologist that discovered the monument, Masaaki Kimura, claimed that the structure was undoubtedly artificial, created by an ancient civilization at least 10,000 years ago, accurately carved and created before sliding into the ocean following unknown tectonic activity. Kimura also goes on to say that not only that, but he can also identify a nearby pyramid, castles, entire roads, other monuments, an entire stadium at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah, this one is quite something. What do you guys think? Let me know. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the creation of Baalbek. Because, holy moly, if this one isn't one of the most mysterious unsolved events in history, I'm not entirely sure what is. Who the hell built Baalbek in Lebanon, the most mysterious ruins of the entire Roman Empire, a monumental, supposedly 2,000-year-old temple to the god Jupiter that sits atop 3 separate 1,000-ton stone blocks? To put it into perspective, the monoliths at Stonehenge weigh about 1/40th of that. Yeah, you heard that correctly. 1,000-ton stone blocks. And despite being the diligent record keepers that they were, there is no record of who ordered this temple to be built, how these monolithic stones were cut, why they were cut, or how they even came to be, and how the temple itself came to be abandoned, because for the most part, whoever built Baalbek just up and left. Now, there are many mythological and cultural legends as to the origins of Baalbek. Some say that Cain built it to hide away from the wrath of God. Others say that giants built it at the command of Nimrod, which would eventually become the Tower of Babel. In fact, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, some claim that the intergalactic landing pad alluded to in its tale was in itself Baalbek, a site constructed purely for the reception of ancient astronauts. In fact, though, the actual mystery of Baalbek resides more within its geographical location. What was the point in cutting such enormous rocks out in the middle of nowhere? Why was this temple even built where it was? And why would the Romans go to such great lengths to create a structure that wasn't efficient in location instead of next to a major city or a port? The Romans weren't exactly known for doing things without efficiency and purpose. That's what made them so successful, after all. In fact, Baalbek seems so out of character to have been built by the Romans that many scholars completely eschew any historical engineering correlation with them and simply state that the Romans never built Baalbek but discovered it and then added their iconic pillars to Jupiter and repurposed the ruins as their own kind of temple. Yeah, I'm stumped, guys. The construction of Baalbek, who made it, when they did, how they did it, and why they did it remains to be one of the most mysterious events in history. Kicking off at number 5, the tomb of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, the legendary Roman politician and general Marcus Antonius, alongside his kindred spirit Cleopatra, may well be the most notorious lovers in the history of our civilization, and although mountains upon mountains of literature have been written about their star-crossed fate, the real mystery of Antony and Cleopatra came after they had both slipped from this mortal coil. Now, if you know anything about the Roman conquest of Egypt, you'll know that around 30 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were not in the Romans' best books, and a general known as Octavian had waged a long and bloody campaign to bring Cleopatra's reign to an end, which he ultimately won, but sadly for us, that's where the trail runs cold, with no leads as to the two lovers' final resting place. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries in antiquity is the exact location of the final burial place of Antony and Cleopatra, but according to several ancient historians, Tonius and Plutarch to name a few, it was recorded that Octavian had permitted the two to be buried together as their surviving children were taken back to Rome to be raised as Roman citizens. There are several leads that their tomb was located somewhere west of Alexandria, but numerous excavations throughout history have proven fruitless. However, they did come close, and between 2008 and 2009, reports of the prestigious Egyptologist Zahi Hawass having found evidence of their fated tomb came to light. Although no concrete evidence has been unearthed, relics and memorial coins of the lovers have been found in small ceremonial tombs, perhaps pointing toward Cleopatra's and Antony's tomb being somewhere in the vicinity. The excavation continues, but whoever stumbles upon the tomb of Antony and Cleopatra will unearth one of history's greatest mysteries. Next up at number 4, the Sack of Baltimore. And now, I love this particular entry, partly for its many layers and potential implications, but mainly for the fact that it's a swashbuckling tale of chaos and carnage that seemingly came out of nowhere. On June 20th, 1631, a small village named Baltimore in West Cork of Ireland was randomly and viciously attacked by pirates. Not just any pirates though, but pirates from the Barbary coast of North Africa, which at the time was synonymous with the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you couldn't tell, that's quite a distance. This incident would go down as the largest attack by Barbary pirates in both Ireland and Great Britain, and seemingly the target was a tiny village tucked in the corner of the Emerald Isle. So it posed the glaring question, why? Was it just a random chance of opportunity after the pirates had drifted off course? Perhaps, but it's not likely. See, the attack was led by a Dutch captain by the name of Jan Janszoon van Haarlem, who had changed his name to Murad Rees the Younger, which, if you can't tell, is a bit of a curveball. But that curveball may have actually been thrown by someone else entirely. You see, despite being a small village, Baltimore was actually in the middle of a power play. At the time, it was under the control of a Gaelic chieftain, Sir Finian O'Driscoll, but the nearby English colony of Cork, led by a man named Sir Walter Coppinger, also had Baltimore in his sights. History is unclear as to who pulled which string, but all signs point toward the bizarre pirate attack being orchestrated by someone else entirely, in the hopes of seizing power away from O'Driscoll. In fact, several texts have even suggested that O'Driscoll's own relatives may have orchestrated the move, as they'd been exiled to Spain following defeat at the Battle of Kinsale. Whoever did it overestimated the bloodthirst of the Barbary pirates though, because following the raid, Baltimore was virtually deserted for several generations. The best laid plans of mice and men, yeah, you know what they say. Next up, at number 3, the Golan Structure. Alright guys, if Cat Shabib had you scratching your head, then the Golan Structure is going to require some form of head scratching machinery. Let me introduce you to the Golan Structure, also known as Rajum el-Hiri, an ancient megalithic monument that resides in the Israeli-occupied portion of Golan Heights, just off of the east coast of the Sea of Galilee. Made up of more than 42,000 basalt rocks arranged in concentric circles with a mound that is 15 foot tall at its centre, the Golan Structure has often been referred to as the Stonehenge of the Levant. Why? Well, of course, because it dates back to at least the early Bronze Age, to between 3000 and 2700 BCE. So what is it? Who built it? What purpose did it serve? Yeah, that'll be a we don't have a freaking clue on pretty much all of those points. The outermost wall of this structure is 520 feet in diameter and 8 feet high, and since archaeological excavations have thus far yielded very few material remains, most Israeli archaeologists believe that the site was certainly not of a defensive position or a residential quarter, but most likely, as the vast majority of these enigmas are, it was a ritual center. And not only that, but a ritual center that is possibly linked to the cult of the dead. But on that note, there's even more of a mystery, because so far no human remains have ever been found at the site, only objects pointing to its function as some kind of tomb. And also, hold on to your hats guys, because this is where it gets weirder. At the centre of the Golan Structure, the actual entrance to a tomb was discovered, one that during the June and December solstices, its axis is perfectly aligned with. Yeah. More questions, fewer answers. The thing is though, as its namesake as the Stonehenge of the Levant, no other structures of its kind have ever been discovered, which is even more of a head scratcher considering the fact that in ancient Britain, as well as in South America, structures like this are pretty common. Some believe that its purpose was to worship Tammuz and Ishtar, the ancient Mesopotamian fertility gods. Others suggest that it was used by the Dakmas of the Zoroastrians to lay out their dead and let the birds remove the flesh from their bones. Some say that it was a calendar or a site to observe the constellations for religious calculations. Maybe it was all of these things at some point in time, but as it remains, we may never know. Coming in at number 2, the Great Lakes Copper Mystery. Oh boy, here we go. If you're not already feeling perplexed at the mysteries of the ancient world, then I'm fairly certain that this one will knock your metaphorical socks off. In the wilds of Michigan's Isle Royale National Park, it remains a beautiful and remote location, but thousands of years ago, the island was home to a thriving mining industry. Yes, mining. The rich veins of copper that ripple through the site's bedrock certainly drew the attention of the early Native Americans, and the fact that they diligently used this ore to make tools and jewelry is evident still. But the actual extent of their operation remains a complete and utter mystery. Why? Well, because around 6,500 years ago, there is clear and startling evidence to suggest that roughly 500,000 tons of copper was mined from the land. 500,000 tons of copper, which simply put, is a staggering amount. Now, the copper culture complex is an astounding feat of ancient civilization regardless, but here is where our mystery takes another turn. You know why? Because Michigan copper is some of the purest copper on the planet. Keep that thought in mind. And 500,000 tons of it, well, frankly put, there should be more evidence to its use throughout the Midwest. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a leap here, and I'm going to point us toward another ancient mystery, one that occurred off the coast of Turkey, roughly around the 14th century BC. A shipwreck that was discovered just off the east shore of Uluburun, discovered by a sponge diver back in 1982. Now, the Uluburun shipwreck is a bit of a mystery in and of itself, but it's with the content of its cargo that we're concerned with here. Within the hull of the shipwreck, over 10 tons of copper oxide ingots were discovered. Now, oxide ingots, which are named so down to the fact that they are shaped with rectangular handholds on either side, were relatively common in the late Bronze Age period of the Mediterranean Sea. You know what is weird? Testing on these ingots later discovered that they were extraordinarily pure for others of its kind. In fact, more than 99.5% pure. The oxides themselves were brittle blister copper with voids and slag bits that only occur when multiple pourings were made outdoors over wood fires. There is only one type of ore of this purity, Michigan copper, the kind mined over 6,500 years ago in the copper culture complex of North America. Yeah, beats me, guys. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, the Nest of Broar. And I absolutely adore this particular Neolithic mystery, and at the moment this is pretty much my direct inspiration for scholarly study of the ancient world. Now, we've covered this area quite a few times on this channel, and if you'd like to find out more about places like Skara Brae, the ancient site discovered on the Orkney Isles of northern Scotland, then please check out our Scottish history list, and also, you know, do your own discovering, because Neolithic Orkney is absolutely amazing. But there's another place that is even more remarkable than Skara Brae, the Nest of Broar, perhaps one of the most important discoveries in archaeological record depicting just what the hell was going on during the Neolithic period of ancient Britain. Now, back in 2003, in a site that occupies the central position with the Orkney archipelago that lies between the locks of Stenness and Harray, an imposing complex of monuments were discovered, a series of structures that seemingly were of pivotal importance to Neolithic Orcadians, and perhaps even further afield, perhaps even the whole of ancient Britain. The site itself, which lies between the already discovered ring of Broar, a Neolithic stone circle that has its own mysteries, as well as the equally mysterious stones of Stenness, dates back to at least 3,300 BC. As of 2016, 14 structures have been discovered, with many of them being built on top of each other, suggesting perhaps an even older use of this site and a location of incredible importance to the Neolithic people of ancient Britain. Without a doubt, though, the most impressive structure, known as Structure 10, which appears to be a Neolithic pyramid, is even more of a head scratcher. Yeah, I just said Neolithic pyramid. Around this site, which was used prolifically up until around 2200 BCE, after which it abruptly stopped, archaeologists have since discovered the bones of approximately 400 cattle, around which the carcasses of several red deer were placed, with many of their tibia bones being cracked and extracted for marrow, suggesting the site of a feast. Do you know what's weirder though? During this event, there is also evidence of the temple being largely destroyed, brick by brick. Seemingly, for some reason, the Neolithic Orcadians built this site as a place of incredible importance, used it for 1,000 years, and then one day threw a party and tore the whole thing down. I have no idea, guys, but most importantly, I want to know. Kicking off at number 5, Stone Tongue. Which again is a pretty damn awesome name for a death metal band, right? But if you're a fan of this series, you'll already know that lists like these are literal golden skull mines for naming yourselves in all your death metal glory. So metalheads that are looking for a band name, take note, please. And also, thank me later. Anyway, Stone Tongue. Let's first cast our gaze back to 1991 in Northamptonshire, Britain, where archaeologists discovered a gruesome and even stranger mutilation that emerged from the remains of Roman Britain. Now, it's no hidden secret that Britain is littered with instances of intrigue from the Roman occupation of Britain, but this one in particular seemingly doesn't fit any sort of logic, or any of the many other mysteries of ancient Britain. At the bottom of a burial pit, buried beneath dozens of other bodies, archaeologists found the skeleton of a man whose tongue had apparently been amputated and instead replaced with a flat stone wedged into his mouth. The burial site at Stanwick near the River Nene dates back from between the 3rd or 4th centuries, where people in Roman Britain would have congregated in small farming communities. Now, it's certainly not rare to find makeshift burial pits in Roman Britain. In fact, they are a dime a dozen. But the strange thing was, this guy was buried at the bottom, face down, And not only was he buried face down, which would usually indicate some sort of fear of him by the community, but his tongue was cut out and replaced with a stone. As researchers noted, this was something that just hasn't ever been identified as a practice so far in archaeological records. There are no other known occurrences of this ever happening in Roman Britain, so far anyway. And the fact that this was on top of the matter of him being buried face down, well, who the hell was he? What was he doing? It is believed that the man would have been in his 30s at the time of his death, and one theory is that he had mental health issues and was actually responsible for severing his own tongue. Perhaps the tongue was the community symbolically making him whole again, but then why was he buried face down? Now, archaeologists are currently trying to correlate this practice to ancient Germanic laws, but its place in a small farming community in Roman Britain, yeah, that remains a complete and utter mystery. Swinging in at number 4, Cat Shabib. And I absolutely love this one, as well as pretty much all of the next few entries, because nothing gets my mind whirring quite like an ancient structure that no one knows what the hell it is, or what it was doing, or why it was even there. Let me introduce you to the Cat Shabib, an ancient wall in southern Jordan that since its identification by British diplomat Sir Alec Kirkbride back in 1948 has had archaeologists scratching their heads ever since. I say identification because Kirkbride certainly didn't discover this structure per se, but instead he noticed that whilst he was flying over Jordan there was a very apparent and very clear line across the geographical landscape. A wall, in fact, that ran 150 kilometers, making it the longest linear archaeological site in Jordan. Now, why would anyone build a wall of such length? Now, the Romans had reason to with the Picts, ancient China had reason to with Genghis Khan, but Cat Shabib? What's that all about? The thing is though, whilst the purpose of this wall is the frantic subject of debate, we do know who built it. The semi-nomadic Bedouin people led by the Arab prince Amir Shabib. Historically, there is a certain recognition of the Bedouin people using the wall, but there is still no concrete evidence to determine its purpose. Archaeologists during the 1940s and 1950s argued that the Cat Shabib was used for military and defense purposes. However, there is a clear problem with that assumption. This wall is far too low for it to have ever been a successful defensive mechanism, and although it is massive in length, at best estimates it stood at around just 1.5 meters high. What was it keeping out? Not a lot. So then why have archaeologists also discovered over 100 ruined towers across its span? Yeah, more and more questions. Oh, and also, did I mention that best estimates point toward it being built in the Iron Age? Yeah, Cat Shabib, everybody. A complete and utter mystery. Coming up next at number 3, St. John's Dance. And you may have heard mention of this one before, but perhaps not in this context. You see, it's important that we note that in modern times, St. John's Dance or St. Vitus's Dance is a terrible disease also known as Sydenham's chorea that affects the nervous system and results in a series of hysterical jerking movements of the limbs often exhibited in young children. Generally speaking, it isn't infectious, but that doesn't figure to explain the countless records of mass hysterical dancing that occurred throughout history, of literally thousands of people across Europe being afflicted by a manic need to dance. The earliest known outbreak occurred in the 7th century and was primarily thought to occur during times of intense hardship, particularly affecting the peasant and working classes. So what? You're a peasant in Dark Age Europe and all of a sudden you just start dancing and can't stop, somehow infecting the rest of your village, town or city, until there's a horde of people doing the exact same thing, potentially collapsing from exhaustion or dying from a heart attack. Well, yeah, because that's exactly what happened. One of the most well-documented cases was in 1518 in the Austrian city of Strasbourg, where a woman named Frau Troffia began dancing in the streets, and within a month 400 people had joined her. Yeah, she danced for a month and loads of people died. Now there are many theories on the true explanation of St. John's Dance, and scholars still argue as to whether it truly was a real contagious disease or merely a social phenomenon. One of those theories suggests a particular fungi had infected their crops, and another suggests that it was all a misunderstanding and St. John's Dance was actually the practice of some secretive European cult. Yeah. Beats me, guys. Swinging in at number 2, the remains of Richard III. And this one, strangely enough, is the perfect blend of ancient mystery and potentially contemporary unexplainable intrigue. Because that's exactly what you all came for, right? Also, I mean, this one is already pretty much solved, but it's in the details where its mystery truly shines. We all know Richard III, right? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. But well, apparently this woman, Scottish author and historian Philippa Langley, knew him a little bit better than anyone else did. Now, it's important to note that history had long forgotten the final final resting place of Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, and after his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth, his remains were scattered to the winds of history. After all, history is written by the winners. Well, let's fast forward to modern times when in September 2012, Philippa Langley led an excavation of a car park in Leicester city centre. A few signs pointed toward it potentially being the ruined remains of Greyfriars Church, but in the words of Langley, she had a strange feeling, one that she couldn't quite place, and something was telling her that Richard III was buried beneath that very car park. Now, the dig team was on a very tight budget and only had one chance at excavating a tiny portion of the car park. And guess what? The exact place that Philippa Langley had a strange feeling about turned out to be the final resting place of Richard III's remains. And not only that, but the parking space that he was buried beneath was marked with a large painted R on the tarmac, used to signify a reserved parking space. I mean, all of this can be explained away, right? Eventually someone would have found the remains of the dead king, but you can't deny the fact that the strange cosmic coincidence that led Langley to his final resting place is much more mysterious than a dead English king in a car park. And finally, coming in at our number one spot, the Tunguska Event. And I absolutely love this entry for its cosmic significance alone and the potential warning sign that we should all be very wary of. Let's head on over to remote Siberia, where on the bright summer morning of the 30th of June 1908, a massive impact explosion, the likes of which has never before been seen in human history, completely flattened a remote area of the Siberian wilderness, covering over 2,000 square kilometers of isolated forest. As far as we know, no one was caught in the blast, but if they were, they would have certainly been obliterated by a shockwave 1,000 times greater than that of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The Tunguska explosion completely flattened over 80 million trees in its blast radius, rupturing their roots like grass to a lawnmower. 50 or so miles away, those native to the region were knocked flat on their feet by the blast, windows shattered and buildings subsided. For all intents and purposes, it was the result of an unimaginable power, and if Tunguska had occurred over a metropolitan area, an entire city would have likely been flattened. So, what was it? Well, the leading scientific consensus is that the explosion of the Tunguska event was caused by the impact of a small asteroid, one that had possibly burned up in Earth's atmosphere and then produced a shockwave that resulted in the aforementioned cataclysm. However, not everyone buys that hypothesis, and many other researchers and scientists have proposed the Tunguska event being the result of a leak of natural gas from deep within the Earth's crust that became ignited by a storm and resulted in the Tunguska Hellfire. Most evidence though points towards Tunguska being the result of an asteroid, albeit one that luckily somehow missed the vast majority of our entire populated planet. It's also important to note that researchers believe Tunguska to be the result of a small asteroid, which is a terrifying thought in itself. It poses an incredibly important question: how would our history have been shaped if the Tunguska event occurred somewhere else? What if its intended target had changed? And more importantly, are we prepared if it ever happens again?
Number 5 on this list is the pyramids. The Great Pyramids are located in Egypt and are some of the oldest structures on the entire planet. The pyramids are said to have been constructed over 4,500 years ago and were made to act as the burial grounds for the pharaohs of Egypt. The Great Pyramid, which is the biggest of all of them, is over 450 feet tall with a base of over 750 feet wide. That's a really big structure and acted as the largest structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. It should also be noted that the pyramids are made up of massive stone blocks. For the Great Pyramid, it's estimated that 2.3 million stone blocks are what keep it standing to this day. Every block of the Great Pyramid also weighs approximately 2.5 to 15 tons. Just a reminder that a ton is 2,000 pounds, so there were some blocks that could have weighed close to 30,000 pounds. All of this is completely unbelievable. So unbelievable, in fact, that people think something else might have been at play in making them. It's currently believed that these were made by humans. It took thousands of humans to construct, but when you think about how monstrous these creations are and the technology that humans had back in that day, it becomes very hard to believe that we were capable of doing that. This has led people to the theory of aliens. These pyramids are also built to face the precise magnetic north, which makes people wonder how the ancient Egyptians could have possibly got that information. The theory is that these aliens came down and built the pyramids and the ancient Egyptians mistook them for gods. This is why in some ancient Egyptian drawings we see gods flying around. The Daily Star also reports the speed of light is 299,792,458 meters per second, and the geographic coordinates for the Great Pyramid coincide with that if you just move the decimal points over several spaces. They believe that this was a clue from the aliens for us to discover later. Frankly, as cool as aliens are, I would honestly rather believe that humans made the pyramids. It's pretty cool to know that almost 5,000 years ago, our species was able to make something like that. I feel like I have a little bit of pride for those ancient Egyptians. Number 4 on this list is the Bermuda Triangle. You've obviously heard about the Bermuda Triangle before and the lore that accompanies this extremely mysterious place. If you don't know what it is though, then the History Channel classifies it as a mythical section of the Atlantic Ocean roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where dozens of ships and airplanes have disappeared. These disappearances have continued to this day, but started hundreds of years ago. Basically since people started crossing over the Atlantic Ocean and records of ships were being kept. In fact, it's believed that William Shakespeare's The Tempest was based on a real shipwreck that happened at the Bermuda Triangle. So legends of this place can at least be dated back to when he wrote that play, which was in the early 1600s. In 1918, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle reached an all-time high when the USS Cyclops, a massive ship from the United States, sank to the bottom of the ocean. This ship was over 500 feet long and had over 300 people on board. It was a horrible catastrophe when it happened. What made this even more stupefying was that the ship had the capability to send out a distress signal and didn't do so, making everyone wonder what on earth happened. What has caused all these shipwrecks and plane crashes over the years is still unknown, but there are some theories. Some people believe that the Bermuda Triangle is home to a massive sea monster, potentially the Kraken or something like that. A massive tentacled monster with the ability to drag a ship down to the depths of the ocean and eat all who are on board. Some people believe that there may even be a wormhole that is out there in the middle of the ocean. A wormhole is a ripple through space-time which experts believe would act as a portal to another time and dimension. The Bermuda Triangle has also been called the Devil's Triangle before, indicating that some people believe this place could be the work of the devil or some strong sea demons out there. Nobody really knows the true cause of the Bermuda Triangle, and considering it's been talked about for hundreds of years, we may never know. Number 3 on this list is the Coral Castle. The Coral Castle is a limestone structure located in Florida. It is super unique and has these strange limestone rocks that have been carved into various figures. Now there's nothing inherently cursed about this place. However, similar to the pyramids or Stonehenge that we covered in our last video, people wonder how on earth this place was made. Edward Leeds Scallon was a self-taught Russian engineer who came to America. He lived from 1887 to 1951 and is credited with being the creator of the Coral Castle. What's absolutely crazy about this story though, is he constructed the structure all by himself. This is what baffles people to this day. How on earth is it possible that one man in the early 1900s was capable of moving these limestones and carving them the way that they are single-handedly? These stones weigh thousands of pounds and there's no way that a man would ever be able to lift these things with sheer strength. Now he was an engineer and people have speculated that it was potentially the use of magnetism, something that he was fascinated with in his life. When asked how he was able to do this, he replied, "I understand the laws of weight and leverage and I know the secrets of the people who built the pyramids." This kind of makes sense, but with the pyramids they had thousands of people working on them all at once. You were only one man. People have theorized that Edward actually had some supernatural abilities that he was hiding from the public. This could honestly be believable because his personality was apparently extremely eccentric and very strange. However Edward was able to construct the Coral Castle, it truly is remarkable. Number 2 on this list is the oldest ghost story of all time. Ever wonder when all this started? When did humans start believing in ghosts, or when did we have our first encounter with a poltergeist? Well, a 3,500-year-old tablet may have the earliest depiction of a ghost as we know them today. This is a small tablet that was made in ancient Babylon and is considered by some experts to be one of the first, if not the first, written depiction of a ghost. The ghostly drawings could be easily missed and you have to really pay attention if you're going to see it. An expert on the subject, Irvin Finkel, says, "You'd probably never give it a second thought because the area where the drawings are looks like it's got no writing, but when you examine it and hold it under a lamp, those figures leap out at you across time in the most startling way." The tablet goes into detail on how to get rid of ghosts and calls for an exorcist. It explains how this exorcist must make figurines of a man and a woman and also speak the words of Mesopotamian god Shemesh to get rid of the ghost. There's also a warning to the reader to not turn around, potentially an indicator that a ghost could be behind you or you could risk getting sucked into the underworld if your focus isn't steady. This tablet also lists a bunch of materials that can be used in rituals, and and that can be used to prevent ghosts from appearing in the first place. This is super interesting because it means that ghosts and spirits visiting the living can be traced all the way back to the ancient Mesopotamians. We were having paranormal events happen to us thousands of years ago, and the action of exorcising demons and ghosts, it all started with these guys. One could argue that they were the founders and innovators of a lot of our ghostly practices and knowledge to this day. Number 1 on this list is Oak Island. Oak Island is a very mysterious island that has been shrouded in lore for years. It's a privately owned island off the south shore of Nova Scotia, Canada. It has so many rumors surrounding it that it's even got its own television show called The Curse of Oak Island that has 8 seasons under its belt. This is a reality television show by the History Channel where they explore the mysteries of Oak Island, and considering they're on season 8, it's fair to say that there have been quite a few mysteries. The one that's gained the most international fame, though, is the Money Pit. The Money Pit is supposedly a place on Oak Island where there's a plethora of buried treasure waiting for somebody to dig it up. This treasure was left by the pirate Captain William Kidd, who lived from 1645 to 1701. There's said to be vast riches here, however no one's been able to find it up until this point. This is largely because finding buried treasure can be extremely difficult, but also due to the curse that surrounds it. The curse that hovers over this treasure states that 7 men will die in search of the treasure before it's found. To this day, there have actually been 6 deaths associated with this buried treasure. That means that if one more person was to die whilst they're looking for it, then the treasure would either reveal itself, or the next person who goes looking for it would be the one who finds it. Problem with this is that there's one more person who needs to die, and I don't think that anyone wants to be that unlucky number 7. Other than this pirate treasure, there's also rumored to be some extremely valuable and mystical items here. Never before seen Shakespearean plays, the Holy Grail, and the Ark of the Covenant have all been linked to Oak Island. If searching for cursed treasure is your cup of tea, and this is definitely the place for you.
Kicking off at number 5, Nzoia Zemlya. And we're starting this list with perhaps one of the most calamitous explorations in the whole of Dutch history, in their pursuit of the Arctic that is wrought with equal parts true naval grit and equal parts just pure bad decision making. But hey, that's why these expeditions are cursed, right? Let me introduce you to a man named Wilhelm Barents, one of the most celebrated Dutch explorers of the 16th century. Born in 1550, Barents made his name as a cartographer, sailing around the Spanish seas and most of the Mediterranean, where he pretty much charted everything and anything. Like many explorers of his time, he was convinced about the existence of the Northeast Passage out in the deep depths of the Arctic, and so soon turned his sights toward there. On his first expedition, Barents didn't find much save for a polar bear out on an ice sheet. And what did his crew decide to do? Well, they tried to capture it, of course, stick it on their ship and sail back home. However, the polar bear wasn't too keen on that notion, and whilst on board, it went on a rampage and killed loads of people. However, during his first voyage, he did discover the coast of Nzoia Zemlya, and he suddenly got the notion that he was onto something. Barents' next attempt came in 1595, where this time pretty much nothing happened other than another polar bear attack and more dead crewmen. On his third attempt, however, Barents was convinced that he was onto something, and in pursuit of the Northeastern Passage, he eventually made his way back to Nzoia Zemlya once again. But this time, his ship and crew quickly wound up trapped in the icebergs and ice floes, and with nowhere to go, the 16-man crew was stranded with the dead of winter fast approaching. Crazily enough, Barents' crew managed to harvest scraps of lumber from their own ship, and they then built a cabin on the ice sheet to seek shelter. They lived there for nearly a year, sleeping next to heated stones and cannonballs just to stay warm, and by the time their food ran out, the crew resolved their hunger by hunting Arctic foxes and straight up killing polar bears with their bare hands. Eventually, almost 12 months later, with the ship still trapped, the crew decided to peace out. They were ridden with scurvy and were days away from eating each other, but incredibly enough, eventually they made it back to civilization. Sadly enough, Wilhelm Barents didn't. He died on the journey back, and he never did find the Northeastern Passage. Swinging in at number 4, the Magellan-Elcano circumnavigation. And if we're talking about death and pure misery, there is probably no saltier tale of the 7 seas than the time that Ferdinand Magellan tried to circumnavigate the planet. Obviously, you've probably already heard of the Magellan-Elcano circumnavigation, the first recorded voyage around the world in human history, often confused with the old Marco Polo thing. The voyage itself began under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, a legendary Portuguese explorer, but was ultimately concluded by the Spanish navigator Juan Sebastian Elcano. Why? Well, that's because things got pretty bad on the way. Let me explain. Magellan's voyage set sail from Seville in 1519, but his first mistake was failing to appreciate just how unimaginably big the Pacific Ocean is. I mean, now we know it's freaking huge, but Magellan didn't have the pleasure of hindsight, and seemingly he only packed enough supplies for an average kind of ocean. After just several months at sea, Magellan's ship completely ran out of supplies, and after floating around in the middle of the Pacific at the point of near starvation, his crew began scraping the rafters for maggot-infested crumbs. Their water supplies had dwindled to mildew, and they were forced to resort to drinking their own urine just to hydrate themselves. Eventually, the crew became so ravenous with starvation that they ripped the leather from the ship's hull and began chewing on it just to satiate their hunger. After months of pure misery, Magellan and his crew did finally make landfall on the island of Guam with barely a ramshackle crew to keep it all together. A few months later, incredibly enough, Magellan made it to the Philippines, where they were then attacked by over 1,000 native warriors in the Battle of Mactan, and Magellan was stabbed in the face with a spear and then obviously died. Pretty much all of the malnourished crew were slaughtered, but another ship managed to survive, headed by Elcano, and yeah, they then completed the voyage. But as you can tell, it was pretty damn harrowing to get around the world.
Number 3 on this list is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is very similar to the pyramids, having been built roughly 5,000 years ago and being so difficult to construct that people think some sort of paranormal events must have transpired. Located in Wiltshire, England, Stonehenge is a monument that features massive stones standing vertically that weigh roughly 25 tons. That's 50,000 pounds of weight that these monstrous stones have to them. The monument is oriented towards the sunrise on the summer solstice, but other than that, not a lot of people know why it's there or what its purpose was. Now it is owned by the Crown and considered a heritage site, but still people wonder, why was it put there in the first place? Some theories involve its effect on sound waves. When two people are playing a pipe and you walk around the stones, then you'll notice an effect where they cancel each other out. Some people have even chalked it up as being an ancient sex symbol, believe it or not. However, the most popular theory is similar to the pyramids in believing that it's aliens. I tend to believe aliens were capable of this more than the periods, to be honest. They are certainly arranged in a strange fashion and they have no set purpose. How is it possible for humans to lug stones that are 50,000 pounds to a location where there aren't that many stones to begin with? Stonehenge just screams like the sort of place where something paranormal happened, in my opinion. Number 2 on this list is Jesus. I feel like this wouldn't be a complete list if I didn't include one of the most mysterious events that occurred in all of history. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago during a tumultuous time. His life was one that we all remember and has inspired millions of people since he passed. His death is where something paranormal may have taken place though. Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. This was ordered by the governor Pilate, who felt the pressures from the Roman people and felt like he had to give in to them. The crucifixion process lasted for over 6 hours apparently, until Jesus finally gave his last breath. After he died, he was taken to his tomb, which was closed off and shut by a massive stone. This tomb was guarded by several officers for days, until on the 3rd day it said that the rock moved and Jesus ascended from that tomb to heaven. His body was no longer in the tomb on this day, and the belief that he went to heaven spread throughout the land. Now, a question a lot of people ask is, how do we know for sure that his body was gone and that tomb was actually empty? Now, we know that because after he was gone and his followers were claiming he was resurrected, then the best way for the Romans to stop that theory would have been to produce the body, which they were never capable of doing. So where did it go? Well, it's widely believed that Jesus ascended to heaven, that God acted and brought his son home to him. Maybe this event is less of a paranormal event and more of a miracle, but I still wanted to include it in this video. Number 1 on this list is the Dropa stones. The legends of the Dropa stones is a little bit up in the air, but if it is true, then there is certainly something paranormal afoot. The Dropa stones are a collection of 716 circular discs that are said to be over 12,000 years old. They have very strange markings on them in a language that hardly anyone is familiar with. These stones were apparently discovered by Chu Pei Te, a Chinese archaeologist in the 1930s who found them inside some abandoned caves. They made their way to a translator who was able to decipher some of the markings and learn that they were referring to humans and aliens. So the theory is that aliens were present 12,000 years ago and had some serious interactions with humans back then. Now, there are a few reasons why we can't take this as being full fact. 1, it's possible that the translator who was in charge of deciphering them is wrong. We can't say for sure that they're familiar with the intricacies of language 12,000 years ago. Number 2 is that today, nobody knows where these stones have gone. They aren't in a museum and their location is unknown. And this is really hard to believe considering there are 716 of them and they would have been one of the biggest archaeological finds in years. All of this being said though, if these stones are real and our translator was correct, then that is undeniable proof of an alien presence from 12,000 years ago, which is pretty cool to think about. Number 5 on this list is the dancing plague of 1518. That's right guys, you heard that right. A plague about dancing. Honestly, I'd never heard of this before, and in my whole time working on this channel, this is actually the coolest and strangest thing that I've ever come across. So in Strasbourg, Alsace, which is now modern day France, in the year 1518, from July all the way to September, people just started dancing. For months, hundreds of people were dancing in the streets of France and they couldn't stop. It's said that one woman started dancing in the streets one day and then some more came and they just kept going for months with absolutely no reason at all. People started thinking that this was the cause of a demonic possession or some ghost that was making people lose their minds, but in actuality, nobody had any idea why these people were doing this. This wasn't a casual waltz either. These people were going hard. These people went so hard that they literally danced themselves to death. I can't possibly imagine going so hard at the club that I died, but that's basically what happened here with these people. There are actual claims that at one point in the heat of all this dancing, up to 15 people were dying per day just from dancing. This death kept happening and these people would continue dancing around all of these bodies. This plague went on until September when it just suddenly subsided and that was that. No explanation, no reasoning behind it, they just went hard for several months and then stopped. That's why everyone thinks that something demonic has to be the cause of all this. Some people have speculated that food poisoning may have played some role, but that just doesn't make any sense to me because it went on for months. Seriously folks, please comment down below what you think about this or some theories about why this happened because it has me pretty baffled. Number 4 on this list is the lost city of Atlantis. Atlantis is a city that is considered to be a utopian society in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was first documented by Plato in 2 of his works, Timaeus and Critias. Now even though Atlantis is often referred to as a city these days, back then Plato described it as an island. This island was located in the Atlantic and was said to be pretty massive, bigger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. This island, or city, was extremely wealthy and had a surplus of resources. This is what led them to being considered a utopia and a highly advanced group. Now Plato describes a great battle between these Atlanteans and the Athenians and says that after lots of hard fighting, the Athenians eventually prevailed in the war. Then several massive earthquakes caused the earth to shift and the entire island of Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and now rests at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. Many people have speculated on how accurate these tales from Plato are, with experts believing that this could just all be a myth. However, the legend of Atlantis started to circulate around Europe many years later and people began searching for this lost city. Nobody has found it to this day, but that doesn't mean that it never existed. Maybe we're just thinking about it the wrong way. Some people have thought that this entire city of Atlantis could have been aliens coming down to Earth and that potentially this island was never really an island to begin with. Plato does describe the society as being a utopia, and an explanation for that would be aliens that have far better technology than we do. Maybe when this island apparently disappeared, these aliens just left. Now that does beg the question, if they're so advanced, how on earth could the ancient Athenians beat them in a battle, which I do think is a very fair point. I do believe that Plato and the people after him have exaggerated this story, and the full truth has probably been lost in history. But I also believe that this tale didn't just come out of nowhere, and something potentially paranormal could be at hand.
Coming in at 3, James Dean's car. James Dean was an iconic American actor who made waves in the 1950s with films such as Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden. Sadly, in 1955, at the age of 24, he died. Now, it's the events surrounding and following his death that are slightly unusual. Before his passing, Dean owned a Porsche Spider, a rare car which he named the Little Bastard. Now, it's in this car that Dean died. On his way to a racing competition, he was involved in a traffic collision that killed him. However, following Following his death, it seems that the car has inflicted misfortune upon others as well. Someone purchased the car not long after in order to fix it up and sell it. However, as mechanics were unloading the car, the engine fell out, breaking both the legs of the engineer. Following this incident, some of the parts of the car were sold to racing fans Troy McHenry and William Estridge. However, once the parts were installed, McHenry crashed his car into a tree and died. Estridge, on the other hand, flipped his car and suffered life-threatening injuries. Coincidence, or do you believe this is a cursed car? Coming in at number 2, Hugh Williams. Now, this is a quick one, but arguably the craziest on our list. This one was posted on crack.com by a user named Bohemian, and it simply says, in 1660 a ship sank in the Dover Straits. The only survivor was named Hugh Williams. In 1767 a second ship sank in the Dover Straits. The only survivor was named Hugh Williams. In 1820 a ship capsized on the Thames. The only survivor was named Hugh Williams. Now, this is crazy, but it seems there's some logic behind it. It's easy for stories to get molded and rewritten through history. Perhaps this was just a retold sea story. It is also worth noting that the last name Williams is very prevalent in Wales and England, as is the first name Hugh. The fact that the survivors shared the same name could just be an odd coincidence. What do you guys think? And lastly, in at number 1, RMS Carmenia. At the start of World War I, the British Navy converted a cruise ship named the RMS Carmenia into a makeshift war vessel. In order to fool the enemy and escape detection, they disguised the boat as a German passenger liner named the SMS Cap Trafalgar, and of course the plan worked. On September 14th of 1914, the Carmenia passed through enemy territory and ambushed the Germans, sinking one of their own vessels off the coast of Brazil. Now, here is where things get crazy. The German ship the Brits encountered and sank was the real SMS Cap Trafalgar, which the Germans had disguised as British cruise ship the RMS Carmenia. Yep, right, if you've lost me, that's understandable. To put it simply, the Brits disguised their boat as a German boat and took down one of the German vessels. The German vessel they took down was the boat they were pretending to be. But not only that, the boat they took down was pretending to be the boat the Brits were using, the RMS Carmenia.
Number 5 on this list is the exorcism of Kennedy Ife. Kennedy Ife was a 26-year-old man who reportedly became possessed by a demon. It started when he got an unexplained pain in his throat and then began to act very strange. He complained that there was a python inside of him and it forced him to bite his own father. He even threatened to cut off his own before his family strapped him to his bed and tied him down. His brother later said to the police that it's clear that this thing was in him, what we believed was a demon, because it was not natural. It was clearly trying to kill him. Kennedy did sadly die, however it wasn't at the hands of a demon, but actually by his own family. Kennedy had been tied to his bed for 3 days before his brother called for medical help. He was extremely dehydrated and developed breathing problems as he was lying there. When the paramedics got there, they pronounced him dead at the scene. The family had attempted to exorcise this demon out of Kennedy through prayer and extensive force. Kennedy's body had been battered through this exorcism as the family attempted to cure his soul. They were eventually all charged with manslaughter, however the jury found them not guilty in court and they were set free. Personally, I can't even imagine how brutal it would have been to be strapped to a bed for 3 days straight, getting beaten and slowly dehydrating. Truly a horrible way to die. Number 4 on this list is Theodore Laxman. Theodore Laxman was a Russian farmer in the early 1800s. For a long time, Theodore had been in disputes with one of his close neighbors for farmland. They had developed a deep hatred for one another and would often sabotage each other's crops. Laxman eventually reached a breaking point after another blow from his neighbor and ended the dispute once and for all by murdering him and his family as they slept. A season passed and Laxman and his family prospered with the new land and their abundance of crops. However, during this time, something began happening in their home. The family felt unwanted there and signs of a demonic presence could be seen. After a while, the wife couldn't stand it anymore and she demanded that they have an exorcist come look at their home. They managed to find an exorcist several villages over to come and take a look at their house. He set up his supplies and was going to perform a ritual to cleanse the house of any demonic presence. When he began the ritual though, that demonic presence finally made itself abundantly clear. A shadow figure erupted from the wall and forced itself into Theodore's body. It looked like a ghost had immediately entered his soul and taken all control of his actions. Theodore's eyes went immediately bloodshot and he turned to his shocked wife and said the words, "You take from me, I take from you." Then he reached out his hands and before the exorcist could stop him, strangled his own wife in front of his children, killing her where she stood. Right as her body fell to the floor, his did as well, devoid of life. A minute later, he started to slowly rouse himself, and after seeing what he had done, broke into a deep sob. He knew that the ghost of his dead neighbor had haunted them, and now Theodore was forced to live with the fact that he killed his own wife with his bare hands.
Next up at number 3, the Narvaez Expedition. And talking of death and misery, this particular entry is pretty much unrivaled when it comes to cursed expeditions. The Spanish conquistadors of the 16th century have a bloody enough history during their march through the Americas, but no such journey is as wrought with death and misery as the Narvaez Expedition. Alongside Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, which is a pretty impressive name, Narvaez and 600 men set sail from Spain with an appointment by the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Charles V, and set about to claim the Gulf Coast. They made their way toward the coast of Florida in pursuit of the coveted gold of the Americas, but before they could even make it there, over 100 men had deserted as the expedition made port in the Dominican Republic after fearsome tales of previous expeditions succumbing to the dangers of the continent made their way through camp. They had the right idea though, because not long afterward Narvaez's fleet of ships were devastated by a hurricane that killed over 60 of his men and a fifth of their horses. That's before they'd even made it to Florida, but once they'd made landfall with diminished supplies and low morale, Narvaez's expedition had barely tasted the horror and pain that awaited them. After several months and failing to fully anticipate the scale and depth of the natives that called the land their home, the Spanish forces were quickly attacked by waves upon waves of native warriors, utilizing guerrilla tactics in the dense territory of the Appalachian people. Eventually, Narvaez's 600 men had dwindled to less than 250, and after crossing a rancid swamp in an attempt to escape, the expedition were near enough starving to death, many of them sick and wounded, Narvaez included. After considering cannibalism, the remaining crew decided to melt down their weapons and reforge them into tools, where hopefully they could chop down a few trees and build a ship to sail back to Mexico. Incredibly, they crafted 5 ships over a month period and set sail on September 22nd, 1528, where they were then battered by an unholy storm, ripping apart the 5 ships to splinters, killing most of the survivors. Yeah, after thinking they'd escaped, only 80 survived, who were then forced to remain in the Americas, scrapping for survival against the natives for years on end. Eventually, out of 600 men, only 4 survived. 4. Coming in at number 2, the Burke and Wills Expedition. And if we're talking about failing to anticipate one's surroundings, then there's perhaps no finer example than the Burke and Wills Expedition. Australia is a pretty huge place, and the vast majority of the unrelenting continent was unexplored for a good reason, because you'd probably die on the way, unless of course you were an Aboriginal Australian. That didn't deter 2 European settlers though, Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills, who were commissioned by the Royal Society of Victoria in 1860 to cross inland Australia. The expedition set out from Melbourne on August 20th, 1860 with 19 men, a herd of camels and horses, and a boatload of supplies. Everything went pretty smoothly up until October of the same year, when the 2 leaders, Burke and Wills, started to get competitive with each other, racing to meet checkpoint after checkpoint and establishing ill-fitting camps on the way. The pair failed to anticipate the strain that it would put on the return journey home. Eventually, they split up most of their expedition party, leaving the majority of them at a site known as Copper Creek, telling them to wait for 13 weeks. By early 1861, Burke and Wills had made it to the northern coastline of Australia, but couldn't technically reach the end due to dense swampland. They'd done their job and actually made it to their destination, but that's when Burke and Wills realised they needed to make it back home. On February 9th, 1861, after reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria, the expedition began their long journey back to Victoria. Obviously, with their supplies dwindled and the harsh, arid climate of the Australian outback reaching fever pitch, the remaining 4 European settlers descended into a state of pure misery as the climate began to take its toll. Charles Gray was the first of the men to die after catching dysentery and being near beaten to death by Burke. Eventually, the 3 remaining men made it back to Copper Creek, only to find it abandoned. The rest of the expedition had given up on them and returned home. By June 1861, both Burke and Wills had died in their attempt to reach the appropriately named Mount Hopeless. One man did survive though, an Irish soldier named John King, who had accompanied the men on their way. He was found near death by the Yandruwanda people, indigenous Australians that had survived in the harsh deserts for thousands of years. They cared for him until he was finally rescued, the sole survivor to tell the ill-fated tale of Burke and Wills. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Shackleton. Because, truth be told, we have to end this particular list on a more than positive note, because despite cursed expedition after cursed expedition, there is nothing greater than human triumph in the face of horrifying adversity. There is perhaps no greater tale of endurance than with the fated expedition of Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton, who set sail in 1914 in pursuit of fully mapping the continent of Antarctica by crossing it entirely from sea to sea. After leaving Buenos Aires on 8th of August 1914 in the aptly named ship Endurance, the expedition began steadily, but quickly the harsh and unforgiving nature of the Antarctic began to reveal itself. As they drew closer to the continent, the Endurance and its crew became stuck in the slowly solidifying pack ice and were eventually completely entombed by the frozen ocean. Now, Shackleton was a fantastic naval mind, and quickly he realized that his crew wouldn't be able to free the ship until the ice had melted on its own accord, and so they pitched up camp on the ice and waited for warmer weather. They waited for 10 agonizing months, ridden with frostbite and pain and misery, and slowly dwindling with both hope and supplies. After 10 grueling months, the Endurance sank into the icy depths before their very eyes, and that's exactly when the cracks in the ice started to show across their own camp, and before they knew it, the ice sheet that they'd called home for 10 months began to break apart. And that's when finally Shackleton rounded his men up in the last remaining lifeboat and headed for the nearest landmass, the barren and bleak Elephant Island. And as you may imagine, during those 10 months, Shackleton's crew had nothing left. Their supplies had diminished and the crew faced starvation. Shackleton knew that the only hope of survival was to try and make it to the nearest outpost of civilization, South Georgia Island, which was 800 miles away, and all they had was a lifeboat to get there. But if you know the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and Endurance, you'll know that somehow, despite all of the odds, despite sailing through the most dangerous ocean on the planet, somehow, through sheer dumb luck and determination, the crew made it, and they survived. Out of 28 men that had left for Antarctica, 25 returned, albeit 3 years later, with a few less fingers than before. Cursed expedition aside, endurance and triumph over adversity always wins out in the end.
Number 5. The WOW signal. In a 1959 paper, Cornell University's physicists had speculated that any extraterrestrial civilization attempting to communicate with radio signals might use a frequency of 1420 MHz, which is naturally emitted by hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. In 1973, after completing an extensive survey of extragalactic radio sources, Ohio State University assigned the Big Ear to the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence famously known as SETI. Giant dish. Think Jodie Foster in Contact. 1977, Jeremy Amon, a SETI volunteer astronomer, was analyzing by hand large amounts of data processed by an old IBM computer. He spots a series of signal intensities and frequencies that left him and his colleagues astonished. The WOW signal was the first radio signal detected from Earth. The signal came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. Amon discovered the anomaly a few days later while reviewing the recorded data. Impressed by the result, on the computer printout he circled 6EQUJ5 and wrote 3 letters beside it. WOW. Leading to the event's famous name. The signal lasted for the full 72-second window during which Big Ear was able to observe it, but has not been able to detect it since, despite several attempts by Amon and others. It remains, this 2020, the strongest candidate for an extraterrestrial radio transmission ever detected. To this day, nobody can explain the signal, even though many have tried, claiming it could have just come from us. I don't know. What do you think? Number 4. Harvard psilocybin experiments. Operation Midnight Climax, 1954, consisted of a series of CIA-run safe houses and what went on inside them in San Francisco, California, and New York City. In 1960, 2 psychologists, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, ordered psilocybin from a Swiss company named Sandoz, with the intention to test if different administration modes lead to different experiences. They believed that psilocybin could be the solution for the emotional problems of the human brain. The first test group was 38 people of various backgrounds. 167 subjects in total participated in the study, willing or unwilling. In 1961, Leary decided to orient the study towards psilocybin mushrooms and the rehabilitation of prison inmates. The San Francisco safe houses were closed in 1965, and the New York City safe houses soon followed in 1966. Operation Midnight Climax and Project MK Ultra were considered to be so secretive that few people, even of the highest government positions, knew of their existence. Midnight Climax being a sub-project of MK Ultra's The Mind Control research program that began in the late 1950s by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was a chemist of the CIA. Unlike Project Artichoke, Operation Midnight Climax gave Gottlieb permission to test drugs on unknowing citizens, which made way for the legacy of this operation. Hundreds of federal agents, field operatives, and scientists worked on these programs before they were shut down in the mid-1960s. Science or sinister?
Next up at number 3, the Massacre of Glencoe. And this one in particular has been immortalised in countless fictional works, paying homage to a terrifying and bloodthirsty event in Scottish history. But as is the case with many things, the truth of this historical instance is full of far more horror than in fiction. Now, the Jacobite uprising was a particularly complex and brutal time in the history of the British Isles, but the worst of it culminated in the Scottish Highlands. After losing the throne of England and Scotland to William III in March of 1689 after landing in Ireland in an attempt to regain the throne, James II and VII recruited a small force of Highlanders to support him in his campaign through Scotland. Now, it's important to note that many Scottish clans have remained loyal to King James, the most profound of which were the MacGregors, the Keppoch MacDonalds, and of course the Glencoe MacDonalds. And keep that name in mind. You see, the thing is, in August of 1691 the government had offered an indemnity to all Scottish chiefs as long as they swore an oath of allegiance before New Year's Day, January the 1st, 1682. In total, the Secretary of State at the time, Lord Stair, offered a total of £12,000 British for swearing their allegiance to King William, which, as you may imagine, was quite the allure for many other Jacobite-leaning chieftains. On top of that, letters of fire and sword were sent out authorising savage attacks on anyone that would not comply to the order, and interestingly enough, it worked. Pretty much all of the Scottish chiefs took the oath. However, Chief Alexander MacDonald of Glencoe wasn't so sure, and he had postponed his submission of the oath until December 31st, 1691. You see, at the time he was hosting 120 men of the Earl of Argyll, and he wouldn't be able to make it to the nearest magistrate of Fort William until January the 6th. Hearing that news, King William ordered swift punishment to the MacDonalds, and the next moment, over 100 of the Earl's soldiers, who had been quartered amicably at Glencoe for more than a week, suddenly turned and attacked the MacDonalds mercilessly. 33 men, 2 women and 2 children were slaughtered by their own guests, who had been fed and watered and entertained without a second thought. And now we can sort of understand the importance of hospitality, can't we? Hopefully. Coming in at number 2, the Black Dinner. And if that previous entry sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones, then that's because George R.R. Martin was pretty damn inspired by British history, particularly the history of Scotland. And while this one instance in particular may well seem pretty damn familiar, but that also doesn't make it any less terrifying, because like I said, history is far more horrifying than fiction, because the Black Dinner actually happened. Let's take it back to the year of 1440, a tumultuous time in Scottish history during the reign of King James II, who was just 10 years old at the time. You see, Scotland was under the shaky yet tentative power share and regent rulership of 2 men, Sir Alexander Livingston and Sir William Crichton. It was the second period of regency in a short space of time after King James I was also briefly under the same sort of stewardship. You see, one of those previous regent stewards was a man named Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl of Douglas, who was an all-around pretty decent guy, so much so that in this story you could consider him to be Ned Stark. You see, by the 15th century the Douglases had become so powerful and damn honourable that some schemers such as Livingston and Crichton saw their family as a threat to the stability of the nation. In 1440, the grandson of Archibald, the 16-year-old William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, was invited to Edinburgh Castle for a spectacular feast alongside his younger brother David. The two of them were invited to dine beside the 10-year-old King James II, and on November 24th, 1440, the small Douglas entourage had arrived. According to legend, the banquet was held in the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, and the young king was completely enamoured by the charming and noble Douglases. At the end of the feast though, after the hall went silent, the head of a black bull was brought out on a platter and paraded in front of them. Under ancient Scottish custom, the head of a black bull was the symbol of death, and in rare customary moments, this formality presaged the death of the principal guests of a feast. As the legend goes, King James II was alleged to have pleaded for the lives of his new friends and for the Douglases to be spared, but it is said that his pleas fell on deaf ears, even as king. Both William Douglas and David Douglas were beheaded in front of the then 10-year-old king. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Sawney Bean. Because talking of dinner, we certainly can't make this list without featuring perhaps the most notoriously grim instance of folklore in Scottish history, the legend of Sawney Bean. Now also, whilst this entry is potentially the most gruesome in the whole of Scottish history, it's also important to note that not all of the legend of Sawney Bean can be historically verified, and the vast majority of it is resigned to the whisperings of folklore. It's just food for thought. Sorry, I'll stop talking about food now. You see, little is known about the early life of the notorious Sawney Bean, but it is said that he may have been born in East Lothian sometime in the late 16th century. When he reached adulthood, he became a ditch digger, but it seemed that the life of honest labour was not for him. He left home with a, and I quote, a vicious woman named Agnes Douglas, who apparently shared Sawney's inclination for ferocity after being accused of being a witch. On the way, they'd rob anyone that crossed their path, and this is where their first taste for a far more sinister crime began to establish itself. It is said that on the road, Sawney and Agnes cannibalized one of their victims. Eventually the couple settled in a coastal cave, a place hidden just beneath Banay Head between Girvan and Ballantrae, where they lived undiscovered for over 25 years. As the legend goes, the cave that they made their home was 200 yards deep, and the entrance was completely blocked by water during high tide. And if that sounds like the perfect place to establish an incestuous tribe of cannibals, then that's because it was. You see, Bean and Agnes produced 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandchildren and 14 granddaughters, the majority of which were the produce of incest between their children. At the height of their terrifying reign, the Bean clan would carefully lay ambushes on the nearby road at night to rob and murder individuals or small groups. Their bodies, stripped and picked clean, would be brought back to the cave where they were eaten. Leftovers were pickled in barrels or dried like jerky. One night, however, after trying to ambush a newly married couple, the Bean clan met their match and the young groom fought them with a pistol and sword in combat. Eventually their secret cave was routed and the Bean clan was captured and executed. Now the actual details of which are down to wild speculation, but one thing is for certain: the cannibal clan of Sawney Bean was said to have murdered and eaten over 1,000 victims. Oh, and also one version of the legend states that the tribe were never actually captured, and the nearby townsfolk were too terrified to go into the cave, so they just blew it up with dynamite. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a sequel to me. Kicking off at number 5, The Witch's Well. And whilst Europe as a whole has had a long tragic line of witch hunting throughout its long and bloody history, there is perhaps one location in Scotland that exemplifies that period more so than any other. Edinburgh Castle is a hive of activity, a beautiful structure that speaks of the city's ancient roots and its mystical origin, but as you walk around its high walls, you'd may be amiss to know that you're walking amongst the same ground of a brutal and horrifying massacre that stretched out over a century. Now, the Witch's Well, a cast iron fountain and plaque, honours the Scottish people who were burned at the stake at Edinburgh Castle between the 15th and 18th centuries. But it was the 16th century, and one king in particular, where the Witch's Well saw more bloodshed than anywhere else in Scotland. King James VI and I of Scotland and England respectively was certainly an intriguing figure throughout British history, but it was his unique brand of zealotry that led to the deaths of thousands of innocent women, each of them without a trial. King James believed that witchcraft was a form of Satanism, and that anyone who possessed the abilities that he perceived as mystical, be it herbology or even dancing, were in fact possessed by the devil himself. You see, King James was obsessed with the notion of witchcraft and would write countless literature about demonology, but all of this culminated in a period that ran throughout the 17th and 18th centuries at Edinburgh Castle. As a result, more than 4,000 alleged witches, nearly all of them female, were mercilessly put to death. In fact, so many of them were brutally murdered that the usual act of burning at the stake was replaced with routine hanging, the last of which took place in 1728. During this horrifying satanic panic, pretty much anyone and everyone could be unrightfully accused of practicing black magic. Many of those that were killed were keen herbalists demonstrating an ancient practice of medicine. Some of them were mentally ill and wrongfully deemed possessed, and even rarer, some of those killed were merely on the wrong end of someone else's malice, murdered over a squabble. It was a brutal time not only in Scottish history but the entirety of the British Isles, and the Witch's Well at Edinburgh Castle stands as a monument, a mortal reminder of those vile deeds. Swinging in at number 4, Skara Brae. And to be honest, I just love saying that name, Skara Brae. Skara Brae. Feels good under the tongue, right? Well, the thing is, for this entry on our list, we're going to be going back pretty far. In fact, further back than any other entry in Scottish history, and perhaps even further back than any other historical instance imaginable, really. Skara Brae is a location far, far older than Stonehenge and far older than even the Great Pyramids of Giza themselves, and it's tucked on a series of little islands just off the coast of Scotland, Orkney. Europe's most complete ancient Neolithic village, which, whilst being completely and utterly amazing in itself, may also be evidence of a far more terrifying event than any of us could have ever imagined. You see, there is a reason why Skara Brae is often called the Scottish Pompeii, because although it is remarkably preserved in a similar fashion to the ancient Italian volcanic city, it also seems to be evidence of a similar sort of disaster. Back in the winter of 1850, a severe storm battered Scotland, causing immense damage to the populace and over 200 deaths. In the Bay of Scale within the Orkney Isles, the storm stripped away a mass of earth, and when the storm cleared, the nearby villagers were astounded to find the outline of an ancient village. Although the local Laird William Watt of Scale conducted an excavation, it wasn't until 1927 that the actual location was fully excavated, which would take another 60 or so years to be completed. Originally, it was thought that the site was from around 500 BC, but when radiocarbon samples were fully tested, it was revealed that Skara Brae was built by at least 3180 BC. Now, as there is evidence of the inhabitants of Skara Brae being taken by surprise and fleeing the site in a hurry, such as remains of choice meats being cooked on the fire left behind, and evidence of one woman fleeing in such haste that her necklace broke as she tried to squeeze through the narrow doorway of her home. Now, while Skara Brae is still very much a mystery, the leading theory is that the disaster in question was another equally terrifying storm, the same kind that unearthed it in 1850. If that's the case, I think we should be on the lookout for a storm.
Number 3 on this list is Rosetta Planker. Rosetta Planker was a young girl from the 1940s who became possessed by an evil demon. Her parents noticed that she started acting strange when her notebooks began filling up with demonic drawings, and her nice, innocent attitude vanished for dark depression out of nowhere. She started having issues at school, which was completely out of character for her, and the parents got to a point where they had to take her out. One day they found her in her room with her eyes rolled to the back of her head, stabbing one of her dolls repeatedly. It was at this point that they realized they had to get a professional in to perform an exorcism. They contacted their local pastor, who set them up with a weathered exorcist. This exorcist had seen his fair share of demonic possessions in his day, but even he wasn't prepared for what happened during Rosetta's exorcism. They laid Rosetta on the bed and strapped her in as they typically would. Then the exorcist began performing his ceremony, but it didn't take long for things to get out of hand. Rosetta began to float off of the bed, flailing her limbs as best as she could under the restraints. Her head started spinning around and around in a completely inhuman way, looking as if it was breaking her neck over and over and over again. She was screaming at this point, but it wasn't her voice or any voice that anyone present was familiar with, nor was the voice making any sense, just demonic gibberish nobody could understand. When her ascension reached as high as the restraints would allow, her chest kept going further up and further up, until finally her chest snapped open and blood exploded everywhere. A black ooze spouted onto her parents, and the exorcist sending them back and disorienting them. The exorcist was forced to stop as he was blown back and covered in this black ooze. When he wiped it off his face and opened his eyes, he saw the ugly remains of Rosetta laying on the bed. The demon had clung onto her soul so tightly that it refused to leave without taking her with it. I can't even possibly imagine what it would have been like to be in that room, or for the parents having to watch something like that. Number 2 on this list is Anneliese Michel. Anneliese Michel's exorcism story actually inspired the very popular horror film The Exorcism of Emily Rose. What happened to Anneliese is certainly not pretty. She was a young German woman who was born in the 50s. All of her life she struggled with serious mental health issues. Depression, hallucinations, and bad psychosis were all side effects of these problems, which she actually had to be hospitalized for at some points. What was very strange was that her symptoms would often coincide with her being around religious acts or religious paraphernalia. This led her extremely religious parents and Anneliese herself to believe that she was possessed by a demon and needed it to be exorcised. She began having exorcisms performed to her when she was 22 years old, and they went on for 10 months. In those 10 months, she had a ridiculous amount of exorcisms performed on her, with the count reaching above 70. That is more than an exorcism a week that was happening to her. After these brutal 10 months though, Anneliese died. The cause of her death was a mixture of malnutrition, emaciation, and just pure starvation. The priests in charge of her exorcisms were taking extreme measures to get this demon out of her and abuse her body along the way. This case was brought to the court and it was proven that these priests were guilty of negligent homicide and had to serve jail time for her death. Similar to Kennedy, it was actually the exorcisms themselves and not the demon that took her life, which is pretty scary if you ask me. Number 1 on this list is the Panama exorcisms. Now I wish that I could describe exactly the ongoings of these exorcisms, but sadly we only have access to the aftermath of what transpired here. The Panama exorcisms happened in an indigenous jungle area of Panama and resulted in the murder of 7 people. The bodies of these 7 people included the likes of a pregnant woman, 5 of her children, and their neighbor. They were found in a mass grave and looked to be only the beginning of the murders if these murderous exorcisms hadn't been stopped when they were. That's because 15 other people were freed from captivity when the police raided the area. Apparently an indigenous run sect had been performing so-called exorcisms and murdering people if they hadn't fully repented for their sins. The prosecutor of this case is quoted saying they were performing a ritual inside the structure. In that ritual, there were people being held against their will, being mistreated. All of these rites were aimed at killing them if they didn't repent their sins. The place where they were performing these exorcisms was a church where they found a naked woman, machetes, and a ritually sacrificed goat amongst other religious paraphernalia. What this group did was kidnap people and then bring them here to perform what they thought was God's will. The leader of the group said that they had received a message from God and that's why they were doing this. This brutal atrocity only happened a little over a year ago as well, so it's still very fresh. I don't know exactly what happened in these exorcisms, but we do know that it resulted in the murder of 7 innocent people, which is just about as scary and sad as you can get.
Number 5, red rooms. I'm just gonna start this off by getting the obvious out of the way. This has nothing to do with the 50 Shades trilogy, so don't bother asking about that icky series that barely knows the truth about anything schmexy. Among the many illicit activities that take place on the dark web, one of the most disturbing is the existence of red rooms. So these rooms have gained a lot of attention and infamy, with many rumors and myths circulating about their existence and operation. While some people believe that red rooms are nothing more than urban legends, others claim to have witnessed them firsthand. So in fact, on Reddit, 4chan, and Hidden Wiki, a kind of, Cliff Notes for dark web beginners, you can find people trading second and third and fourth hand accounts of red rooms that have opened and closed. The concept of red rooms first apparently appeared on the dark web sometime in the early 2010s, and their name derives from the color of the room where the supposed acts take place. The term red room gained popularity after a Japanese animation featured a pop-up ad asking, "Do you like the red room?" And if users attempted to close the ad, a full-sized window would open with the names of individuals who had supposedly accessed the red room before and were found dead. The idea is that viewers pay to watch a live stream of a person being tormented and eventually killed, and they can even interact with the tormentor and other viewers through chat or messaging functions. Payments for these services are made in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin to ensure, anonymity. Despite the attention that red rooms have received, it's kind of challenging to determine whether they actually exist or not. But here's the thing, accessing them is not as difficult as one might expect. A simple Google search for redroom.onion, that link can yield results for these supposedly hidden pages. In addition, the technical limitations of the dark web make it almost impossible to stream live video, and payment analyses suggest that there are very few people actually paying for these services. Some people claim to have accessed them and seen the gruesome acts taking place, while others insist that they are nothing more than hoaxes designed to scare people. There have been no verified cases of people being killed in real time on the dark web, and many experts believe that the concept of red rooms is more of a fantasy than a reality. One reason why it's so challenging to verify the existence of these red rooms is because the dark web is notoriously difficult to navigate and monitor. It's impossible to search for specific websites on the dark web using traditional search engines like Google or Bing, and accessing dark web sites requires specialized software like Tor or I2P. Furthermore, many dark websites used encryption and other security measures to protect their users' identities and activities, making it pretty challenging to track or trace them. However, there have been some instances where law enforcement agencies have claimed to have shut down red rooms or arrested their operators. In 2015, the FBI arrested a man named Peter Scully in the Philippines who was accused of running a red room called Daisy's Destruction. The site was said to feature videos of Scully harming young people, and it was allegedly one of the most extreme examples of a red room ever discovered. Scully was eventually eventually convinced of multiple crimes, including, young people sexual harm, human selling, and killing. Internet users continue to seek out the elusive and horrifying red rooms on sites like Reddit and 4chan, despite many claims that, it's nothing more than an urban legend. But let me know your take in the comments. Honestly, I believe they're out there, but I've also watched way too many crime shows for my own good. Number 4. What's for sale? I have wandered many an oddities market in my time, and heck, I've even performed an act at one that would make most people flinch. I've seen folks selling real and fake bones, demonic dolls, niche, schmexy fine leather goods, vintage clothes, tarot readings, banned books, World War II memorabilia, and oddities I can't even begin to describe. And heck, that's just the stuff like I can remember off the top of my head. So, what does the dark web have that I can't find in a niche marketplace? Oh, the no-no pills and powders. Sadly, I don't think I'm allowed to say the D word on here, so pardon me if things take a turn for the Looney Tunes way of speaking for safety's sake. I found plenty of tales on the interwebs about the crafty ways folks have been mailed their purchases. User Oiraves on Reddit is adamant that while he personally never received anything from any deep web affiliated sales folk, he did live with a roommate who would constantly receive the strangest brochures. At first, they would receive stuff for like cruise lines, which he wrote off as junk mail, but they came so frequently and started getting stranger, making him suspicious. For folks like me who might be wondering how pamphlets can get strange, apparently the mail ranged from, Christian Mingle brochures to petting zoo brochures, pretty much, any kind of pamphlet for any and all services one could think of. At the time, our narrator kind of felt like someone was gaslighting him, but he never said anything, and the brochures would disappear as quickly as they came, so he didn't really have time to stress it. That is until one fateful day when he walked into his apartment and his roommate was delicately cutting into a brochure to mull out a small baggie of powder. All I'm gonna say is that it definitely wasn't flour or icing sugar. Now, one time our narrator almost threw out a regular sized business envelope since after he opened it up, it looked similar to regular silly junk mail, until he noticed that the envelope had a hidden flap on the inside where there was, no things. Other transportation or delivery methods known to the dark webs include using a comic book that's still in the plastic sealing, but the entire back page directly inside the cover was a sheet of acid, or a CD in a case, once again, with the plastic sealed, and it looked totally ordinary until you peeled back the case artwork. In terms of how some folks get away with powders, pills, and other stuff, apparently the trick is to use collectible Pez dispensers already filled with pills that look like, yep, they've never been opened. Funny story actually about white powder. One time I was doing a virtual script reading of the incredible movie Ready or Not, and had to mime using powder of my own, and I actually wound up inhaling way too much icing sugar up my nose, and oh my god, did it ever burn. Thankfully, I was off screen after it for a while, so I was able to recover in private, but it will be a permanent memory for the rest of my life.
Number 3. Exercise Tiger. Exercise Tiger, or Operation Tiger, was a series of large-scale rehearsals for the D-Day invasion of Normandy 1944, in which the military's lack of communication resulted in friendly fire from an Allied convoy being destroyed by German submarines, resulting in the deaths of at least 750 Americans. Wow. Of the 2 ships assigned to protect the convoy, only one was present. The second ship that was supposed to be present had been in a collision, suffered damage, and had to be repaired in secrecy. Because Allies' naval headquarters were operating on different frequencies, the American forces did not know this, and the first practice assault took place and was marked by an incident involving friendly fire. They didn't know it was an exercise. Set for 7:30 a.m., it was to include live ammunition to acclimatize the troops to the sights, sounds, and smells of war. This followed an order made by General Dwight Eisenhower, who felt that the men must be hardened by exposure to real battle conditions. Several of the ships landing that morning were delayed until 8:30, an hour later, and some landing craft didn't even receive word of the change at all. Landing on the beach at their original scheduled time, the second wave came under fire, suffering an unknown number of casualties. Rumors circulated along the fleet that as many as 450 men were killed, and it remained in secrecy in classification memos for numerous years after. I've seen Saving Private Ryan, and I can only imagine what this site looked like. Number 2. The Manhattan Project. Nuclear fission by chemists in 1938 made the development of the atomic project a theoretical possibility. The Manhattan Project was a research and development exercise during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. It was led by the United States with the support of the United Kingdom and Canada. Nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory that designed the actual explosives. The Army component's first headquarters were in Manhattan, hence the name, the place name, and the official code name. The project began in 1939 and employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion to fund. Research and production took place at more than 30 sites across the US, United Kingdom, and Canada. During 1939, physicists drafted the Einstein-Szilard letter, which warned of the potentials of this extremely powerful creation of a new type. They had it signed by Albert Einstein and delivered to President Roosevelt. In 1941, President Roosevelt approved the atomic program, and Roosevelt chose the Army to run the project rather than the Navy because the Army had more experience with large budget scientific projects. Plutonium was then chemically separated from the uranium by scientists, and the Fat Man and Little Boy implosion weapons were created at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. The first nuclear device ever detonated was the Trinity test, conducted at New Mexico's Alamogordo Range 1945. Little Boy and Fat Man explosives were used a month later in the atomic droppings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the immediate post-war years, the Manhattan Project conducted weapons testings, development of new weapons, promoted and supported medical research into radiology, and it maintained control over American atomic weapons research until the formation of the United States Atomic Energy Commission in 1947. Classified stuff, people. These were very scary times. And coming in at number 1, the Philadelphia experiment. This one scares me, and I pray it really is a hoax because there's a lot of documents that relate to this subject around this time that don't really add up. The Philadelphia experiment was an alleged event witnessed by Carl Allen and the United States Navy shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in October 1943. Allen describes an experiment where the US Navy attempted to render itself invisible, cloaking the destroyer USS Eldridge, and the bizarre scientific events and results that followed. On Allen's account, the destroyer was successfully made invisible, but the ship inexplicably teleported to Norfolk, Virginia for several minutes and then reappeared back in the Philadelphia yard. The ship's crew is supposed to have suffered various side effects including insanity, intangibility, and being frozen in place. The story first surfaced in late 1955 when Allen sent a book full of handwritten letters referring to the experiment to a US Navy research organization. The US Navy maintains that no such experiment was ever conducted, that the details of the story contradict well-established facts about the USS Eldridge, and that the physics the experiments are claiming to be based on doesn't even exist. What do you think? I think this actually happened and the gruesome details of the side effects are just misinformation. I don't know. I get a weird feeling about this one. Too many science experiments at that time.
Number 5, the Warner Brothers Jungle Habitat. Originally opening on July 19th of 1972, this park closed its doors by 1976, which is a really bad timeline for a theme park that was technically never completed. The first time Jungle Habitat made headlines was only months after it first opened for business, when an Israeli tourist named Abraham Levy was riding through the safari in a taxi cab and decided to roll down the window to get a better look at some of the animals roaming about. 2 lions attacked the car and mauled the 26-year-old tourist, causing lacerations to his face and shoulder. He took credit for the harm, citing his own foolishness, which helped to dodge a media onslaught. Well, for the most part. By the end of the year, reports of animals escaping into the wilds of West Milford were far too many in volume to be ignored. Besides sightings of harmless animals like peacocks, there were rumors spreading about dangerous animals such as a pack of wolves and a lion being sighted along local roads. These sentiments, voiced 28 years ago, are identical to the rumors still running rampant today. Yep, you heard me, today. Tales told by West Milford residents who have looked out in their backyards include wandering ostriches and a band of baboons running amok in the town's pharmacy. Emus, baboons, and even wolves are just some of the uncaged critters which were known to have escaped the park. I feel like I found the origins for the Night at the Museum franchise. On July 8th of 1974, a 68-year-old visitor from Long Island was grabbed by the trunk of a baby elephant, which then slammed her against a fence and bit her. The woman, Elizabeth Ennis, was later awarded $200,000 by a court. In an account in the New York Times, she claimed the elephant bit her on her right hand, and because of the trauma incurred by being slammed into the fence, she had persistent pain in her right side that prevented her from lifting heavy items. Her husband was awarded $5,000 for loss of companionship. So the animals at the park also had a tendency to damage the cars that passed through. An e-museum for the park says that tigers like to bite and pop car tires, and monkeys like to rip antennas off of cars. Sounds like a lack of good animal training and boundaries to me. So right after the park closed in 1976, some animal carcasses were left outside. This pile grew until 30 animal bodies, including that of an elephant, a bison, a camel, some zebras, were all left lying until April, when the ground had thawed enough to finally bury what was left of the bodies. The 6 months that they were left exposed was a violation of state laws, which stated that any animal should be buried within 48 hours of its death. Despite this violation, Warner Brothers was not sanctioned. Jungle Habitat is gone now, but not forgotten. Reports of mysterious kangaroo sightings in remote corners of West Milford still turn up from time to time. Number 4, Under the Sea Gone Wrong. Disney's River Country was the first water park at Walt Disney World, and possibly the first themed water park ever. Look, as much as I love Disney World, and I'm mentally planning my next trip back, I'm here to call a spade a spade. Some consider River Country to be the first water park anywhere, but that depends on how you define a water park. Yes, River Country opened almost a year before Wet n Wild in Orlando, but there were public pools and lake parks with water slides and other aquatic play equipment long before River Country opened. So just as Disneyland had reinvented the amusement park 21 years earlier, River Country reinvented aquatic recreation. The water park's grand opening was on June 20th of 1976, and on Thursday, August 28th of 1980, a sad Associated Press story appeared in newspapers throughout North America. It was reported that a rare but deadly disease caused by an amoeba found in Florida freshwater lakes had claimed its fourth victim, a New York youngster who had spent his vacation swimming at River Country. The disease, amoebic meningoencephalitis, attacked the nervous system and brain. You don't want to know how many tries it took me to say that. The youngster died after the amoeba entered his nose, went through the nasal passage, and attacked the nervous system, including the brain. Investigators from the U.S. Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and the New York Health Department pinpointed River Country as the source of the amoeba after the parents reported that the amusement park was the only place where he went swimming. So photos and maps of River Country show that the park had two bodies of water. The smaller one was a clean, clear swimming pool. The larger one appeared to be a natural cove, completely open to Bay Lake, which is the largest natural lake at Walt Disney World. At some point in the 1990s, Walt Disney World banned swimming in its lake. The 1995 map of Walt Disney World still included the resort's beaches under the swimming section, whereas the 2000 edition made it clear that the beaches were strictly for sunbathing. But River Country stayed open. There was never another death from amoebic, very long word that I'm not going to try and say again, linked to River Country. But there were two drownings, one in 1982 and the other in 1989. So River Country had its normal seasonal closing at the end of the 2001 season, but when the time came for it to reopen for the 2002 season, it didn't. River Country never reopened. Number 3, hire a hitman. Alrighty, so this is where things get a little more into the legend part of today's video. One of the greatest myths about the dark web is that you can hire an assassin, with some folks saying that that kind of service costs as little as, $5 grand. Just a couple of months of rent. We all have that kind of money lying around, right? In this economy? Here's the thing, officially speaking, technically no dark web search records were ever found of an actual hit attempt or assassin operating there. Now, I'm not saying it's never happened, since I don't exactly have the time or expertise to go deep diving for a week, to try to find a legitimate person selling those types of services, but what was found by experts? So a network of dark web websites and individuals who accepted Bitcoin in exchange for absolutely nothing at all. I get using Bitcoin for secrecy and all, but trust me when I say you'll never catch me using it as a form of payment. If I ever start talking about cryptocurrency on social media, assume I've been hacked or kidnapped. Scammers out there are relying on the veil of mystery that the dark web has provided, whereas in reality, more injuries and killings happen through Craigslist and similar websites that are widely available on the surface web. It took me a moment to research that one, but yep, people have actually hired hitmen off of Craigslist for crimes. Granted, it never seems to end like they want it, so I wouldn't really recommend it. Also, leaving a digital trail is always a mistake if you want to do something naughty. Now, I'm not speaking from experience, just common sense. Number 2, Silk Road. Silk Road was an online black market and the first modern darknet market that was launched back in 2011 by its American founder, Ross Ulbricht, under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. Hey look, I love a good reference to The Princess Bride, so that got me. The name Silk Road comes from a historical network of trade routes that were started during the Han Dynasty between Europe, India, China, and many other countries on the Afro-Eurasian landmass. 2 other individuals were also closely involved in the site's growth and success, known as Variety Jones and Smedley. In June of 2011, Gawker published an article about the site, which led to an increase in notoriety and website traffic. As part of the dark web, Silk Road operated as a hidden service on the Tor network, allowing users to buy and sell products and services between each other anonymously. To give you an idea of just how widespread it was, a former FBI special agent called it the Amazon of illicit substance sites. According to reliable sources, on Silk Road, you could buy no substances, illegal services, like hacking into private accounts, pirated content, fake passports, and more. All transactions were conducted with Bitcoin, which, I guess it does help with protecting user identities, but yeesh. The website was known for its illegal substance marketplace, among other illegal and legal product listings. Between February of 2011 and July of 2013, the site facilitated sales amounting to around 9 million bitcoins. In May of 2013, Silk Road was taken down for a short period of time by a sustained DDoS attack. On June 23rd of 2013, it was first reported that the DEA seized 11.02 bitcoins, then worth a total of $814, which the media suspected was the result of a Silk Road honeypot sting. The FBI has claimed that the real IP address of the Silk Road server was found via data leaked directly from the site's CAPTCHA and was located in Iceland. IT security experts have doubted the FBI's claims because technical evidence suggests that no misconfiguration that could cause a specific leak was present at the time, but in October of 2013, the FBI shut down Silk Road and arrested Ross. Silk Road 2.0 came online the next month, run by former site administrators, but was shut down the following year as a part of Operation Onimus. Number 1. Mariana's Web. Already, not to be confused with Matt Webb, the fantastic guitarist from Mariana's Trench, one of my favorite bands, because goodness knows that could be an easy mistake. The legend of Mariana's Web appears to get its name from the deepest part of the ocean though, Mariana's Trench. It's apparently the deepest part of the dark web, a forbidden place of mysterious evil. Maybe. Depending on where you get your Mariana's Web myths, it's where you'll find the darkest secrets humanity has in its history. The secret location of Atlantis and the Vatican secret archives, or a database of archives belonging to the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. Now, if any of those titles sound familiar, I would recommend checking out some of the other content we put out here, since that's the type of stuff I like to talk about. But here's the thing, Mariana's Web is the definition of spooky BS, especially because it's technically impossible. It's supposedly only accessible through quantum computers, which really only exist in science fiction. This is once again where the legend part of today's title comes into play. But let me know in the comments if you think it exists, since honestly I wish it would. It would make my life a heck of a lot easier if I could hack into the Vatican archives and get the answers we all deserve.
Kicking off the list at number 5, we have the Gateway to Hell, also referred to as the Well to Hell. In 1989, a Russian science team had headed out to Siberia and they dug 9 miles down into the ground. Now that's quite deep. Now at one point the drill started to spin really fast, so they thought, okay, maybe we just hit a pocket in the Earth's crust. Cool, that happens, naturally. There's pockets in the earth, like blackheads in our face, it happens. They naturally felt all this heat rise up through the hole. So far this sounds like classic old Mother Earth. Yes, magma is hot, and usually when you dig 9 miles into the ground, you'll run into some. This is when things start to take a dark turn. The heat was actually way more brutal than they had predicted, around 2,000 degrees. That's pretty hot. So the next idea they had was to send a microphone down and see if they could record some activity. Maybe get a clue as to what's going on. Maybe it's a rave, who knows? Maybe it's a really hot rave. Upon closer inspection, they had heard sounds that resemble a large group of people screaming. What? Okay, so the mic only picked up 19 seconds of audio because it had, well, melted, of course. The audio was just haunting. Like, I remember hearing it not too long ago, and it stuck with me. It sounds like one louder voice is yelling over like a bunch of others.
Warn you, what you are about to hear is very disturbing indeed.
Which is just impossible. Okay, now of course no one's going to be down that deep, and many argue that this is just tectonic plates moving against each other, which sounds like a decent explanation but definitely less fun. But this story is just too creepy to not include in our list. People all around the area were legit worried that they had just opened the gates to hell. Now with all these dark entities and demons now being free in the world. So what do you guys think? Backdoor to hell, or just Mother Earth telling us to, I don't know, smarten up and relax a bit? Take a listen and you be the judge. Now before we continue on to number 4, if you guys could go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, because it does go a long way here at the studio for us. You guys rock, thank you so much. Okay, now back to the list. Number 4, the Black Bird of Chernobyl. So around 1986, the people around the power plant started having these wild sightings, described as, well, as you would guess, like a giant black bird with red eyes and large wings. Not your typical big bird that we're dealing with. Reports were flooding in more and more, and then later on in April 26, when reactor 4 had a nuclear meltdown, some people had even talked about how they saw this giant black bird on top of the reactor beforehand, like Batman, only horrible. Many of the workers that evacuated also reported sightings of this large beast, even mentioning that its wingspan was around 20 feet. Mine's like 7, maybe 6.5, I don't know. Theorists online also came to the conclusion that this is the same bird that had been spotted in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, before the collapse of the Silver Bridge on December 15th, 1968. So could this quite literally mean the omen of disaster? Large black-winged creature? I mean, it checks out. The wardrobe seems rather fitting. Another really creepy plot here: before the events of both of these disasters, there were reports of creepy phone calls and even these crazy nightmares. Now, I know prank calls might be pretty common and nightmares are just another day in the park for some. Or maybe the Black Bird of Chernobyl is the one to blame. West Virginia's Mothman shares a similar look, so what do you guys think? Is this the same creature, or are these reports just sightings of the endangered black stork bird? Let us know in the comments down below.
Number 3, Joyland Deaths. Located in Wichita, Kansas, Joyland once featured state-of-the-art rides and attractions, holding a reign of 55 years of fun and joy. Today, the once popular park is being reclaimed by nature. piece by piece by piece. So Joyland came into existence on June 12th of 1949 and was founded by Lester Ottaway and his sons, Herbert and Harold. Herb Ottaway had a passion for steam engines and race cars, and he refurbished both types of vehicles. By 1934, Herb had refurbished a miniature steam locomotive and cars and was traveling with them to county fairs in Kansas and Colorado. Joyland was open to give Herb's refurbished locomotive a more permanent home. As the attraction became more popular, the Ottoways eventually added a number of different rides and games to the amusement park. Lester Ottaway passed away in the mid-1950s, and his sons continued running Joyland until the early 1970s when they decided to retire. Joyland was then sold to Stanley and Margaret Nelson, who owned the park until it closed its doors in 2004. Joyland featured attractions such as a wooden roller coaster, which I love, a wacky shacky dark ride, a log jam, a sky coaster, bumper cars, a carousel, and a Ferris wheel. On April 6th of 2004, a 13-year-old girl was enjoying a Ferris wheel ride with her friends when the restraint bar holding them in came undone. The young girl fell more than 30 feet, suffering multiple head, arm, and leg injuries. The Ferris wheel was immediately closed while both private and federal investigators looked into whether everything was safe and up to code. The ride was later reopened after these investigations were wrapped up. Also, another notable ride at Joyland was the wooden roller coaster that was known as the Nightmare. Although the roller coaster was a staple at the amusement park, it too saw its fair share of injuries, which is a shame. Like, I really love wooden coasters. On May 25th of 1977, somebody in the single digits of age stood up in one of the carts and fell, died at the scene from the injuries sustained from the fall. Another death occurred 20 years later, on August 27th of 1998, when 35-year-old maintenance worker Kevin Briley was under the ride trimming the grass. He stood up and was tragically hit by the coaster and passed away. My heart hurts telling that tale because, like I said already, I'm such a huge lover of traditional wooden roller coasters. You know, there's just something about narrowly avoiding whiplash that I personally find thrilling. And go figure, Joyland closed its doors in 2004. Number 2, doomed before it could open. The Pripyat amusement park was set to have its grand opening on May 1st of 1986, in time for the May Day celebrations, but these plans were cancelled on April 26th when the Chernobyl disaster occurred, just a couple of kilometers away. Several sources report that the park was opened for a short time on April 27th before the announcement to evacuate the city was made to distract, residents from the unfolding disaster nearby. Constructed under the Soviet Union as a park of culture and rest, typical of many large cities in the then Soviet Union, the amusement park's attractions were manufactured by the Yeskik-based firm Attraction, who were responsible for the construction of many of the amusement parks which remain to be seen around the former Soviet Union today in various states of repair. Located northwest to the Palace of Culture in the center of Pripyat, the park had 5 attractions. The iconic 26-meter Ferris wheel titled Circular Overview, Autodrome bumper cars, a paratrooper ride called Chamomile, Russian swing boats, and also a carnival Pew Pew game. Fun fact, the successor to the original company is still manufacturing the Ferris wheel, paratrooper, and bumper cars to the similar designs as of 2017. Radiation levels around the park kind of vary though. The liquidators washed radiation into the soil after the helicopters carrying radioactive materials used the grounds as a landing strip, so concrete areas are less radioactive. However, areas where moss has built up can emit levels amongst the highest levels of radiation in the whole of Pripyat. So the Ferris wheel actually made news in September of 2017 when Polish tourists turned it mechanically for the first time since 1986. Thankfully, they returned it back to its original position, but kinda neat that it could still work. Number 1, a cursed history. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park opened its doors in 1926 when proprietor Conley Snidow Sr. purchased the land. His vision to build a place for local families to relax and enjoy time together was realized as the coal miners from local towns descended on it each year, making it a fantastic destination for summer vacations. The park was full of activities. It featured a man-made swimming lake, a racetrack, concessions, and cabins for visitors, looking for an overnight stay. The big cornerstones were the Ferris wheel and the swings, 2 rides that were popular with everyone who spent time at the park. And you know what? That all sounds pretty idyllic to me. Tragedy, though, began to grip the amusement park in the 1950s, when several deaths shocked locals. A young girl's life ended on the swing ride when a delivery truck backed into her seat, killing her in place. Another youngster lost his life when he drowned in the swimming pool after his arm got stuck in a drain pipe. And by 1966, this amusement park closed its doors to the public, and the land sat dormant for decades. In the 1980s, the park again welcomed visitors when Gaylord White acquired the land and set out to restore it to its former glory. In addition to purchasing a Ferris wheel, he found a swing ride that seemed just like the swings that once thrilled guests. Now, fun fact, when they installed the swings on the property, they realized the swings weren't just similar, they were the exact same swings from years prior, something that they decided to advertise during the grand reopening. The Lake Shawnee Amusement Park welcomed tens of thousands of visitors during its second run, which ran for just 3 years in the 1980s. Unfortunately, high insurance prices forced the White family to close their doors for the second and final time after those couple of short seasons, forcing them to pivot pivot to other activities to keep the land active. They hosted fishing tournaments in what used to be the swimming lake, and they planned to create a space on the property for mud bogging, a motorsport the family knew would draw crowds to watch. While excavating a mud bogging track, the White family made a series of surprising discoveries that added depth to the property's history. For starters, the part was built over a Native American burial ground, with an archaeological dig uncovering 13 bodies, mostly young folks. In the 1700s, the property was the active home base for the Native Americans until they seemed to suddenly disappear. Among the bracelets, clothing, and tools that excavators found, they also found mass graves that suggested as many as 30,000 people had been buried on the property. But, that's not the darkest history of the land. In 1783, Mitchell Clay was the first European settler to make a home in the area, which was heavily inhabited by the Shawnee Native American tribe. So while Clay was gone to town one day, the Shawnees surrounded 3 of the Clay descendants who were working in the fields. Bartley met his end first, and Tabitha, hearing the explosion, ran to her brother, where she was attacked and cut by a stabby implement. Her body was dismembered, and both of their scalps were taken by the entire group. Their brother Ezekiel was captured and burned at the stake. A historical marker on the road leading to the park commemorates their memories. One could wonder if the tragic history of the grounds is the reason for the 6 deaths that occurred at the park, eventually leading to it being closed down in 1966. And many locals, including the park's new owner, claim the park to still be haunted.
Number 5 on this list is the Catholic persecution in Britain. This happened in the 16th and 17th century and was really not a good time to be alive if you were Catholic. The list first says, Britain has been trying to rebrand its historical image with tea and monocles, though it's hard to do given how violent its history has been. We're not even talking about the colonies here. A civilian in Old Britain may die in a variety of ways depending on the time period. The worst, however, would have probably been during the Catholic Rebellion and their eventual persecution. It was generally a time of upheaval in Europe, largely over the question of which kind of Christianity is the best one. The situation was especially bad in England as the ruling Protestants really did not like the Catholic population. If you were suspected of being a Catholic or harboring one, there were a number of creatively horrifying ways you could die. One woman was slowly and publicly crushed to death simply for refusing to talk when she was questioned for supporting the Catholics. You could be drawn and quartered, hung, or just lynched by a mob. The mob thing was rare as the central authorities made sure to intervene and kill you themselves before the situation got so out of hands. How nice of them. Yeah, so just a casual death by public crushing for maybe supporting Catholicism. This is a time in history that I feel doesn't get brought up nearly enough based on what happened. In all honesty, I didn't even really know about this time until I started doing some research for this video. Maybe that is because the British government has tried to do a full rebrand and doesn't really want to bring up the dark past of what was once one of the worst times to be alive. Throughout history, people have consistently been persecuted for their beliefs and how they want to live their lives. This was one of the worst examples of that in history, and it's definitely not a time that you would have wanted to be alive. Number 4 on this list is the Siege of Sarajevo. This time really isn't that far off from us at all, folks. This siege took place from 1992 to 1996. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, and had you have lived in this place during that time, life would have been hell. List first says, sieges are an overall bad time to be in, and we highly recommend not being in one if it could be helped. Some of the most prolonged sieges in history, like the Siege of Leningrad, have been huge humanitarian disasters too, as sieges primarily affect the citizens. One particularly horrifying siege that isn't mentioned that often is the Siege of Sarajevo by the Serbs, which is also the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. It went on for almost 4 years, and close to 14,000 people ended up dying. If the incessant shelling on primarily civilian areas like the market didn't get you, you could die in many other ways. People were dying just from the harsh cold as there were no fuel supplies in many parts of the city. Quite a few of them had to move into shared spaces with other families without any amenities, turning an otherwise functioning city into a giant refugee camp. Many people were killed by snipers who deliberately targeted civilians. Think about being a citizen in that city during that that time. Your entire life is literally just about surviving at that point. And not just for a week or for a month, for literally 4 years. 4 years of constant attack in horrible conditions to live in. 4 years of fearing that you and your family are gonna be killed. 4 years of freezing and having no good food to eat at all. And this literally happened not that long ago, guys. This just as easily could have been one of us that was caught living there. You were just in the wrong place in the wrong time, and now your life is uprooted and you need to fight to stay alive.
Number 3, the Ivan Vasily. Haunted Russian ghost ship, anyone? Here we go. Coming in next, we have the story of a haunted freighter. Whenever I read anything about haunted ships, it always leaves a chill going down my spine. I don't know. Since I saw Ghost Ship when I was younger, I just can't shake it. The story begins in 1897 when the ship was first built. It was built, of course, to transfer goods across the Baltic Sea to the Gulf of Finland. Now, the ship had enough coal to travel 2,500 miles, driven by its triple single expansion steam engine. Now, for the first 5 years of her travels, nothing crazy happened. It was built well. No muss, no fuss, you know? No problem. Then, in 1903, the Russian government was getting ready for war with Japan, so the cargo is a bit different now. Instead, it had now been carrying war materials. Not good, not a great omen. As the crew set sail across the Indian Ocean, they had noticed an eerie feeling was present with them on board. So much so that there are even sightings of this dark, mysterious entity that looked like a human, but with no features, like no face, and the scary qualities you never wish to see on someone, you know? And then later on, one of the crewmates woke up screaming, maybe from an awful nightmare, or so they thought. The screaming continued and continued until other men intervened, and eventually everybody was screaming, and now everyone's fighting each other. What the hell's going on? One of the men ended up jumping overboard to his death, and after that, they had obviously calmed down. They were super emotional over what had just happened, and of course very confused. Then it happened again a couple nights later. The same thing, with one man jumping overboard. They were convinced that whatever entity or presence they felt wanted them dead. So when the ship finally arrived to land, a few of them jumped out early and swam to shore the rest of the way. They were like, nah, we're out of here. That's how bad it got. The Russian government didn't believe this take, so they were ordered to return back to the boat. And the next destination was Hong Kong. The same type of incident happened again on this journey. Even once the ship had arrived in Hong Kong, the captain actually committed suicide while docked in the same way as others. He jumped off of the boat while it's in the port. It's crazy. For future trips, it was hard to find a group of sailors to agree to boarding the Ivan Vasily. I mean, you can't blame them. No chance I would get even close to the ship. I don't like boats in general, especially not boats that make you jump into the water. That is a hard pass. Number 2, UBV 76. We now go to a forest north of Moscow, where there is a mysterious sound coming from a shortwave radio station. Now we're talking about a shortwave radio station that has the nickname the Buzzer. You might have heard of it. So 25 times a minute for 24 hours a day, since the late 70s, you would hear this sound. It sounds like that. Kind of sounds like an old phone when it vibrates just on its last leg, you know? It's like, ugh. Well, this buzzing hasn't slowed down, and many people have tried to solve the mystery. So yeah, since 1973, this former Russian Soviet Union shortwave radio station has been broadcasting the same thing, except for the odd time when you'll hear a voice message that reads UBV 76, and then random names and numbers like UBV 76, and then 74, 27, 99, Boris, Roman, Olga, Anna, Larissa, just random names and numbers. These names are said every few months, and then once it's over, the buzzing resumes. See, nobody has quite figured out what it means. Some are convinced that it's a countermeasure for nuclear conflict. It's just a buzzing noise and it's creepy, right? Like that's already by itself, I don't like this. Audio experts were able to figure out that the noise was being recorded by a microphone, like an actual mic. The sound was coming through. It wasn't like a predetermined sound that just clicks in every few seconds. Like this is a live feed from a mic, because sometimes with these broadcasts, you would hear conversations in the background. Like on November 3rd in 2001, part of a Russian conversation was heard. So many have come to the conclusion that the tone is coming from a tone wheel used in a Hammond organ. These voice messages were rare until around 2010, and then listeners reported more and more random voices. The buzzing is assumed to be there as a channel marker, you know, to keep the frequency occupied, and it's off time. The transmitter was located near Povarovo, Russia, about 10 kilometers northwest of Moscow, near the village of Lozki. Sorry if I'm saying those names wrong, by the way. The purpose behind the broadcast hasn't been confirmed by broadcast officials, but Rimantas Plekis, a former minister of the Communication and Informatics of the Republic of Lithuania, states that the voice messages are to confirm that the operators at receiving stations are alert. I mean, that's a pretty cool way of checking in. Just spitting some names and codes and then bam, back to work. Or maybe there's a bigger conspiracy afoot. Maybe there's some secret Russian operation like we saw in Stranger Things. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have the Black Volga. Okay, we got haunted ships, we got haunted broadcasts, but what about some secrets behind a black car? The Black Volga legend began around 1960 to 1970. This fancy limousine that would supposedly take children from right off of the streets. The nation at this point was living in fear of the Cold War, so this wasn't taken lightly. Reports would say that there were no driver in the Black Volga, and this is way before Tesla and autopilot, so don't even think about that. However, some have gone so far as to say that Lucifer himself was operating the car behind the wheel, which is wild. What a crazy Uber that would be. That or crazed nuns. So if you were to claim that the Volga wasn't involved in any of these children's disappearances, you would be dead within 24 hours. So if you think about talking about it right now to the person next to you, better off just keeping it to yourself. Better be safe than sorry, guys. Some iterations of this story have the car as red, but it's most commonly cited as an all-black GAZ-21 Volga with white wheel rims and white curtains. The story also has something to do with Lavrentiy Beria, who was driven around slowly around the streets of Moscow in an armored Packard limousine. He would then point out young women to be taken back to his mansion. Just an awful garbage human being. The young women were kidnapped apparently so their blood can be used as a cure for leukemia, while others believed it was organ theft by the KGB. One of the creepiest versions of this tale have to be from the late 20th century, when the Black Volga car is sometimes spotted with license plate 666, which is just a great number. And then when the car would approach passerbyers in the street, the driver would inform them saying they have 24 hours to live, with the words being, "Tomorrow you will die at this hour." I mean, at least they're giving a heads up, right? Gives you time to kind of get your affairs in order, maybe slam some laundry, text a few friends, I don't know. If any car approaches you, be super cautious, but if it's a Black Volga with Satan in the driver's seat, just start running.
Number 5 on this list is a gamma ray burst. A gamma ray burst is just one of those things, guys, where if it happens, then GG, there was really nothing that we could have done. Discover magazine says, if you could watch the sky with gamma ray vision, you might think you were being stalked by cosmic paparazzi. Once a day or so, you would see a bright flash appear, briefly outshine everything else, then vanish. These gamma ray bursts, astrophysicists recently learned, originate in distant galaxies and are unfathomably powerful, as much as 10 quadrillion times as energetic as the sun. The bursts probably result from the merging of two collapsed stars. Before the cataclysmal event, such a double star might be almost completely undetectable, so we would likely have no advance notice if one is lurking nearby. Once the burst begins, however, there would be no missing its fury. At a distance of 1,000 light years farther than most of the stars you can see on a clear night, it would appear as bright as the sun. Earth's atmosphere would initially protect us from most of the burst's deadly X-rays and gamma rays, but at a cost. The potent radiation would cook the atmosphere, creating nitrogen oxides that would destroy the ozone layer. Without the ozone layer, ultraviolet rays from the sun would reach the surface at nearly full force, causing skin cancer and, more seriously, killing off the tiny photosynthetic plankton in the ocean that provide oxygen to the atmosphere and bolster the bottom of the food chain. Gamma ray bursts and what they entail are very complicated. In all honesty, scientists really don't know that much about it. So mapping out when this could happen, or if it's even possible to destroy us like we're talking about, it's really hard for scientists to do because they just don't know. Number 4 on this list is mass insanity. Okay, so this one is very interesting, guys, and something that I think we all need to become more aware of. Discover magazine says, while physical health has improved in most parts of the world over the past century, mental health is getting worse. The World Health Organization estimates that 500 million people around the world suffer from a psychological disorder. By 2020, depression will likely be the second leading cause of death and lost productivity, right behind cardiovascular disease. Increasing human lifespans may actually intensify the problem because people have more years to experience the loneliness and infirmity of old age. Americans over 65 already are disproportionately likely to commit suicide. Gregory Stock, a biophysicist at the University of California at Los Angeles, believes believes medical science will soon allow people to live to be 200 or older. If such an extended lifespan becomes common, it will pose unfathomable social and psychological challenges. Perhaps 200 years of accumulated sensations will overload the human brain, leading to a new kind of insanity or fostering the spread of doomsday cults determined to reclaim life's endpoint. Perhaps the current trends of depression and suicide among the elderly will continue. This is something that we need to tackle in the next 50 years because it's turning into a real problem. Number 3 on this list is the Sengoku period. This was a period that took place in Japan from about 1467 to 1600. List verse says, the Sengoku period, lasting over 100 years, was one of the most defining parts of Japanese history, as well as one of the most influential. A lot of historical Japanese pop culture is set in that period, as it was a time of consistent war and rapidly shifting political climate. There were more warlords fighting for territory than you could count, as the central power of the shogun had weakened in recent times. For someone living in that period, war and suffering would have been part of your daily life. Apart from opposing factions regularly raiding villages and towns for supplies, civilians were often caught between battles they had nothing to do with. Of course, that wasn't the case in every village across Japan, as many of them thrived due to the shifting landscape too. For those caught between the battles or just lost in the vast swaths of ungoverned Japanese territory though, it was a dangerous time to be in. The period was noteworthy for its brutality and general disregard for human life, and gave way to some of the most fearsome samurai warriors in Japanese history. There are a few documentaries on this time period of Japan, and they were all very informative and super interesting. It's pretty neat to look back now and see what was going on, but back then, having to live through it, that would have been horrible. It really was like a massive game of Risk that everyone was playing. And even if you were just a farmer trying to survive, it didn't matter. You were now caught up in this massive game of Risk, and your life was constantly on the line. Number 2 on this list is the Roman Empire. Okay, wait, I thought the Roman Empire was supposed to be one of the greatest empires ever. Well, it was. And if you were one of the leaders or a member of the elite class during this time, then you were laughing. But for some, it wasn't as nice. Specifically, the miners. The Roman Empire had a lot of slaves, mostly people that were taken from conquered territories and forced to work for the Romans. The worst possible place that you could be sent though was the mines. If you were a slave and you got sent to the Roman Empire mines, then it's about to get horribly bad. The conditions were awful down there. Mining was relatively new back then, and there wasn't really any advanced technology to help these people. Not that they would have received any help anyways though. The Romans were brutal to these people, and specifically handpicked people they didn't like to be sent down there. Disease was widespread because people were literally worked to death and never cleaned. They were given very little food, and if they weren't producing quick enough, then they would just be killed. And oftentimes, these killings were of amusement to the guards as well, and they would mutilate you or throw you in a pit with a hungry wild animal. There were literally no redeeming qualities to the mines at all, and you probably wished for death if you got sent there. And finally, number 1 on this list is the year 536. Kind of a specific year here, folks, but from what I've heard, it was literally the worst. This verse says, when us laymen talk about the worst times in history, we're thinking of stuff like violence and proximity to cannibalism. We don't have any scientific parameters to measure how bad a time is for the people living in it, though we can make educated guesses. When it comes to actual scientists though, they don't bother with guesses or estimates, and have calculated the exact year it was the worst time to be alive in history, the year 536. Apart from the falling empires the world over and general political chaos, the year 536 also marked one of the worst global famines in human history. The famine was due to ash in the air blocking the sunlight, which isn't surprising as there were also quite a few humongous volcanic eruptions aliens around that time for good measure. The foggy eclipse of the sun, as it was described then, was visible everywhere in the world, giving the whole thing an even creepier vibe. Combine that with brutal conflicts in many places around the world, and you know why the researchers chose the year 536 to be the absolute worst one in history. So basically, year 536 was just hell on earth. Everyone was either dying or fighting, or they were dying of not having any food at all. It's kind of crazy to think that only a few thousand years ago, this could have been us. Nowadays, farming is so advanced that most of us are in a pretty good place when it comes to food, but back then, if the river dried up or the sun didn't come out, that was it, guys. We just aren't gonna be eating anymore. Just be thankful that the year is 2022 right now and not 536.
Get off at number 5, Coral Castle. And no, that is not my imitation of Rick Grimes trying to call his son a fortified structure. Sorry, that was a terrible joke. But the actual mystery of Coral Castle is equal parts true engineering enigma and equal parts perhaps the most American thing that you've ever heard of. Along the highways and byways of rural America, there are countless tourist attractions that litter the way, but one of them in particular may actually have a much more intriguing mystery than the rest. Just before 1920, a Latvian man named Edward Leedskalnin was jilted by his young bride just a day before their wedding, and so dejected and depressed, Edward left his home country to head to America. Here, after becoming a recluse and discovering a strange affinity for magnetism, Edward spent the next 28 years constructing a bizarre megalithic castle from oolite, a limestone sediment similar to coral. Now, although the vast majority of this structure now is ruinous, which operates as a popular tourist attraction on the roadside, the actual structural properties of Coral Castle have baffled people for decades. Given the fact that Leedskalnin worked completely alone, shifting over 1,000 tons of oolite rock into place with no conventional machinery and no other means of hauling such a large amount of minerals and materials. As the legend goes, at one point a few local teenagers claimed to have stumbled upon Leedskalnin working on the structure late at night, reporting that he had caused the blocks of coral to move like hydrogen balloons, floating perfectly into place without the aid of any tools. Strangely enough, this led to wild rumours that Leedskalnin was using telekinesis to build the castle, a claim which he refuted. In fact, the only tool that Leedskalnin ever spoke of using was a machine that he referred to as a perpetual motion holder. Before his death, whenever he was asked how he constructed the place, he simply stated that he understood the laws of weight and leverage well, and on several occasions he stated publicly that he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids, and that once you know how to do it, it's easy. I mean, this one is a little tongue-in-cheek, but what do you guys think? Another eccentric recluse with too much time on his hands, or a structural genius that had insight into a long forgotten knowledge? Let me know. Coming in at number 4, Kaspar Hauser. And who the hell was Kaspar Hauser? A mystery that has completely perplexed historians for nearly 2 centuries, leading to an insane web of speculation, an entire network of conspiracy that extends its tendrils all the way to the royalty of Napoleon. On the 26th of May 1828, a teenage boy appeared on the streets of Nuremberg, Germany. His name was Kaspar, a boy of 16. He was filthy, could speak only a few words, and had a letter with him addressed to a captain of the Bavarian cavalry. He kept repeating the phrase, "I want to be a cavalryman as my father was," in Old Bavarian, but the city guard dismissed his ramblings and imprisoned him as just another vagabond in Nuremberg Castle. His strange origin drew the attention of the city's mayor, who claimed that despite his stunted appearance, the boy had an excellent memory and was quick to learn. Eventually, after befriending the mayor, Kaspar spoke of what he could remember of his life before, and explained in great detail at living totally alone in a darkened cell 2 meters long, 1 meter wide. Each morning, Kaspar said, he would wake to find rye bread and water next to his bed. Periodically, he said the water would taste bitter, and after drinking it, he would sleep more heavily than usual, where he'd wake up to find his hair and his nails had been cut. Kaspar claimed that the first human he had contact with was a mysterious man dressed in a dark hood, his face completely covered. He taught him to write his name and taught him the same phrase he would repeat when he was found. Eventually, this story led the European aristocracy to believe that Kaspar was an exiled prince, held captive for his entire life to prevent a line of succession. As the year passed, Kaspar would live and learn in many of the Bavarian noble houses, where allegedly there were many attempts on his life by the same hooded men that he had described in the darkened cell. They got him in the end though, and on the 14th of December 1833 he was mysteriously stabbed and he died 3 days later. On his grave in Latin read the words, "Here lies a mysterious one who was killed in a mysterious manner." Beats me.
Number 3 on this list is the collapse of the vacuum. No, everyone, we are not talking about your brand new Dyson. This is a much bigger vacuum. Discover magazine says, in the book Cat's Cradle, Kurt Vonnegut popularized the idea of Ice 9, a form of water that is far more stable than the ordinary kind, so it's solid at room temperature. Unleash a bit of it and suddenly all water on Earth transforms to Ice 9 and freezes solid. Ice 9 was a satirical invention, but an abrupt, disastrous phase transition is a possibility. Very early in the history of the universe, according to a leading cosmological model, empty space was full of energy. This state of affairs, called a false vacuum, was highly precarious. A new, more stable kind of vacuum appeared, and like Ice 9, it quickly took over. This transition unleashed a tremendous amount of energy and caused a brief runaway expansion of the cosmos. It's possible that another even more stable kind of vacuum exists, however. As the universe expands and cools, tiny bubbles of this new kind of vacuum might appear and spread at nearly the speed of light. The laws of physics would change in their wake and a blast of energy would dash everything to bits. Now we're kind of in the same boat as we were with the gamma ray stuff. Scientists don't think we need to worry about this in the next 50 years, but they also truly have no real idea. This is some advanced stuff and we just aren't at that scientific capability to be able to predict events like this. If the current vacuum did collapse, then at least it would end quickly. We'd all be gone in a millisecond pretty much. Number 2 on this list is rogue black holes. Rogue black holes are especially scary to scientists because we know that they exist and we have absolutely no idea what to do if one was coming our way. The problems with black holes are that they're black, and that makes them really difficult to point out. Researchers guess that there are probably 10 million black holes in our Milky Way galaxy. They have to guess because they really can't be sure, as they can't see them. If a star or planet or asteroid, for instance, was coming towards Earth, then we'd be able to pick it up pretty quickly, and even if we couldn't do anything about it, at least we'd know. A black hole could totally sneak up on us without any warning. One day we're chilling and the next day we're getting sucked into oblivion. Considering there are over 10 million of these space mines floating around the galaxy, this is a pretty scary and real possibility. And number 1 on this list is nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is one of the fastest growing areas of science and also one of the scariest. Discover magazine says, before you've even gotten the keyboard dirty, your home computer is obsolete, largely because of incredibly rapid progress in miniaturizing circuits on silicon chips. Engineers are using the same technology to build crude atomic scale machines, inventing a new field as they go called nanotechnology. Within a few decades, maybe even sooner, it should be possible to build microscopic robots that can assemble and replicate themselves. They might perform surgery from inside a patient, build any desired product from simple raw materials, or explore other worlds. All well and good if the technology works as intended. Then again, consider what K. Eric Drexler of the Foresight Institute calls the gray goo problem in his book Engines of Creation, a cult favorite among the nanotech set. After an industrial accident, he writes, bacteria-sized machines could spread like blowing pollen, replicate swiftly, and reduce the biosphere to dust in a matter of days. And Drexler is actually a strong proponent of the technology. Now, this could just be a mishap, but there are also scenarios where humans could use nanotechnology for evil and sinister purposes. A terror organization, for instance, could go nuts with something as strong as this. And think about it. How could we defend ourselves? We're talking about tiny miniature robots. Like, they could creep into our skin and boom, we're done.